Imagine waking up in a world where the horizon doesn't just end, it drops into an abyss. There are no satellites, no GPS, and the only way to know what lies across the ocean is to sail until you hit land or die trying. For thousands of years, humanity lived in a hallucination of geography. Maps weren't just tools, they were weaponized myths, religious propaganda, and beautiful lies. We didn't just get the shapes of continents wrong, we invented entire worlds that never existed. This is the story of how we spent 2 millennia lost in the dark, and the high-stakes errors that changed the course of history forever. The story of the map does not begin with a sailor, but with a priest and a philosopher. In the ancient world, a map was not a way to find your way to the next town, it was a way to explain your place in the universe. To the early Babylonians and Egyptians, the world was a flat disk, a tiny island of order surrounded by a chaotic, infinite ocean. Their maps were small, etched into clay tablets, depicting the earth as they saw it from the ground, a circle with their own kingdom at the dead center. This was the first great error of cartography, the center of the universe complex. By the time we reach ancient Greece, the stakes began to rise. Around 500 BCE, Alexander attempted what many thought was impossible, drawing the entire inhabited world. But without measurement tools, he relied on pure symmetry. He assumed the world must be a perfect shape because the gods favored order. He drew the Mediterranean at the center, with Europe, Asia, and Libya, Africa, as 3 equal segments. It was beautiful, balanced, and completely wrong. He hadn't seen these places. He had simply decided that if the world were a masterpiece, it must be symmetrical. The true shift occurred in Alexandria, Egypt, the intellectual heartbeat of the ancient world. A man named Eratosthenes noticed something strange. On the summer solstice, the sun cast no shadow in a well in Syene, but it did cast a shadow in Alexandria. Using nothing but a stick and a deep understanding of geometry, he calculated the circumference of the Earth with shocking accuracy. He proved the world was a sphere. However, this discovery created a new, terrifying problem. If the Earth was a massive ball and humans only occupied a tiny fraction of the top, what was on the other side? Fear began to dictate the ink on the parchment. Philosophers hypothesized the existence of antipodes, people who lived on the bottom of the world, walking upside down. But they believed the equator was a torrid zone, a belt of fire so hot that no human could ever cross it to find out. This belief paralyzed exploration for centuries. Mapmakers began to fill these unreachable gaps with imagination. If they couldn't go there, they would invent what was there. Then came Claudius Ptolemy. In the 2nd century AD, Ptolemy wrote Geographia, a work so influential that it would mislead explorers for the next 1,500 years. Ptolemy was a genius who gave us the concepts of latitude and longitude, but he made one fatal mistake. He ignored Eratosthenes' accurate measurements and used a much smaller estimate for the Earth's size. He also depicted the Indian Ocean as a landlocked sea and suggested that Africa stretched all the way to the South Pole, connecting to Asia. Because Ptolemy's maps looked scientific and used math, people trusted them implicitly. His errors weren't seen as guesses, they were seen as gospel. For over a millennium, sailors didn't try to go around Africa because Ptolemy's math told them there was no way around. We were trapped by the brilliance of a man who had never left his library. The world was shrinking in the minds of men, even as the true Earth remained vast and waiting. The stage was set for an era where religion would take the pen away from the scientists, turning maps from navigation tools into holy icons. As the Roman Empire crumbled and the light of classical science dimmed, the map underwent a radical transformation. The mathematical rigor of Ptolemy was discarded, replaced by something far more powerful and far more dangerous: divine certainty. For For the medieval mind, a map was no longer a tool for navigation, it was a mirror for the soul. If you lived in Europe during the early Middle Ages, you didn't look at a map to find out where you were going. You looked at it to find out where you stood in relation to God. This era gave birth to the TO map, perhaps the most visually iconic and scientifically inaccurate design in human history. The concept was simple and devastatingly symbolic. Imagine a large circle, the O, representing the entire world, surrounded by a great ocean. Inside that circle was a T shape made of water. The horizontal bar of the T represented the Don and Nile rivers, while the vertical stem represented the Mediterranean Sea. This T divided the world into 3 known continents: Asia at the top, Europe on the bottom left, and Africa on the bottom right. But the most striking feature wasn't the geography, it was the orientation. In the modern world, we take for granted that north is at the top of the map. In the medieval world, that would have been unthinkable. The top of the map was east. Why? Because that was the direction of the sunrise, the symbol of the resurrected Christ, and the location where the Bible placed the Garden of Eden. When you oriented yourself, you were literally turning toward the Orient. At the very center of these TO maps sat Jerusalem. It was depicted not as a city, but as the navel of the world. This wasn't an accidental error, it was a theological requirement. If the Bible said Jerusalem was at the center of the nations, then any map that showed otherwise was considered a heresy. This created a massive problem for reality. To keep Jerusalem at the center, mapmakers had to squash and stretch continents like putty. Europe was shrunk, Africa was distorted, and Asia, the land of mystery and the Bible, was bloated to massive proportions. This was a time of cartographic amnesia. The spherical Earth of the Greeks was largely forgotten by the general public, replaced by the image of a flat, holy disk. But the true danger lay at the edges of the O. Because the Church taught that all humans descended from Adam and Eve, mapmakers struggled to explain what lay in the distant, unexplored corners of the world. If there were people in the Antipodes, the lands on the other side of the world, how did they get there? Did Christ die for them too? To solve this, cartographers populated the edges of their maps with the monstrous races. On the fringes of Africa and Asia, maps depicted skyopods, men with a single giant foot that they used as a sunshade, and blemmies, creatures with no heads and faces in their chests. These weren't just decorative flourishes, they were warnings. The map told the viewer that the farther you moved from the holy center of Jerusalem, the less human the world became. Reality was being swallowed by folklore. One of the most famous examples of this mindset is the Hereford Mappa Mundi. It is a massive vellum map that survives to this day, and it is a masterpiece of beautiful errors. It shows the Tower of Babel, the labyrinth of Crete, and the path of the Israelites through the Red Sea. It is a map of history and myth, not a map of dirt and water. If a sailor had tried to use the Hereford map to cross the English Channel, they would likely have ended up at the bottom of the sea. This age of faith created a paradox that would last for centuries. While Arab scholars in the East were preserving Greek science and perfecting the astrolabe, Western Europe was retreating into a dream world of symbols. The maps were stunningly beautiful, filled with gold leaf and vibrant pigments, but they were effectively blindfolds. As long as the map was a religious document, exploration was stagnant. To break free, humanity would need a reason to value gold more than grace. They would need a reason to stop looking for Eden and start looking for a way to the spice markets of the East.
While medieval Europe was busy mapping the location of the Garden of Eden, a scientific revolution was quietly unfolding in the deserts of the Middle East and the courts of North Africa. This was the Islamic Golden Age, a period when the works of the Greeks, long lost to the West, were translated, refined, and expanded upon by brilliant scholars. While the TO maps of Europe were shrinking the world into a religious symbol, Islamic cartographers were doing something revolutionary. They were measuring it. The driving force behind this wasn't just curiosity, it was necessity. The Islamic Empire was vast, stretching from Spain to the borders of China. To govern such a territory, the caliphs needed accurate postal routes, tax records, and most importantly, the precise direction of Mecca for daily prayers. This religious requirement forced a leap in mathematical accuracy that the West wouldn't catch up to for centuries. They perfected the astrolabe, a pocket computer of the ancient world, allowing travelers to calculate their position by the stars with unprecedented precision. The pinnacle of this era arrived in the 12th century at the court of King Roger II of Sicily. Roger was a Norman king, but he was a man of immense intellectual curiosity. He invited the greatest geographer of the age, Muhammad al-Idrisi, to create a new map of the world that would combine all known knowledge. Al-Idrisi didn't just sit in a library. He interviewed every merchant, sailor, and traveler who passed through the busy Mediterranean ports. He cross-referenced their stories, discarding the myths of monsters and focusing on distances, climates, and terrain. The result was the Tabula Rogeriana, the most accurate map produced in the first 1,000 years of the Common Era. It was engraved on a massive disc of solid silver, weighing nearly 300 pounds. But if a modern American looked at it today, they would think it was upside down. In Islamic cartography, south was at the top. This was because many of the cultures that embraced Islam were north of Mecca, and looking up toward the holy city meant looking south. Al-Idrisi's map was a masterpiece of mostly right but devastatingly wrong. He correctly depicted the Earth as a sphere and divided it into 7 climate zones. He mapped the Mediterranean with surgical precision and gave the first glimpse of the complex river systems of Africa and Asia. However, the map had a massive, invisible wall, the Atlantic Ocean. Al-Idrisi called it the Sea of Darkness. He wrote that the ocean was covered in perpetual fog, with waves as high as mountains and whirlpools that would swallow any ship. Because of this terrifying description, even the most advanced sailors of the Islamic world refused to sail west. The map showed a world that was open and traversable from Spain to China, but it ended abruptly at the shores of the Atlantic. This psychological barrier meant that while Al-Idrisi had the best data in the world, he still couldn't conceive of the Americas. To him, the world was a massive, interconnected landmass surrounded by a terrifying, impenetrable void. There was another significant error that would later haunt history: the size of the African continent. Al-Idrisi, following some of Ptolemy's old misconceptions, suggested that Africa curved back toward the east, almost touching Southeast Asia. This made the Indian Ocean look like a giant lake. This error was crucial because it suggested that there was no way to sail around Africa to reach the spice-rich lands of India. Despite these flaws, Al-Idrisi's work was the bridge between the ancient and the modern. He removed the monstrous races and replaced them with cities, trade routes, and mountain ranges. He proved that maps could be tools of statecraft and science rather than just religious icons. But his work remained largely unknown in Northern Europe for centuries due to the Crusades and religious friction. Europe remained lost in its TO dream world, while the silver map of Al-Idrisi sat in a palace in Sicily, a blueprint for a world that the West wasn't yet brave enough to explore. The world was waiting for a spark, a reason for the sailors of Europe to stop fearing the Sea of Darkness and start trusting the math. That spark wouldn't come from a scientist, but from the most famous traveler in history, Marco Polo.
By the late 13th century, the world was opening up, but not through the waves of the ocean. It was opening through the dust and heat of the Silk Road. For centuries, Europe had been a backwater, a collection of feuding kingdoms that knew almost nothing of the Far East. They knew China existed only as a vague rumor of Serica, the land of silk. But then came a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo. His journey would span 24 years, thousands of miles, and would eventually provide the raw material for the most dangerous map errors in history. When Polo returned to Venice in 1295, he told stories that sounded like fever dreams. He spoke of cities with thousands of stone bridges, paper money that acted like gold, and black stones that burned like wood, coal. But for cartographers, the most important part of his story was the geography. Polo described the vastness of Asia, stretching much further east than anyone had ever imagined. He spoke of a magnificent island nation called Cipangu, modern-day Japan, which he claimed was overflowing with gold and situated 1,500 miles east of the Chinese coast. The problem was that Marco Polo wasn't a cartographer, he was a storyteller. While he likely did visit the court of Kublai Khan, many of his measurements were based on hearsay or merchants' miles, which were notoriously unreliable. When his book, The Travels of Marco Polo, became a medieval bestseller, mapmakers scrambled to update their charts. They began to stretch the continent of Asia further and further to the right. On the maps, the world was starting to look lopsided. This led to the birth of the Catalan Atlas in 1375. This map was a turning point. It abandoned the circular TO shape and tried to incorporate Polo's data. It showed the caravans of the Silk Road and the cities of India. However, because Polo had exaggerated the size of Asia, the mapmakers made the continent massive. In their minds, Asia was so wide that it nearly wrapped around the entire globe. This error created a mathematical illusion. It made the Atlantic Ocean look much, much smaller than it actually was. This wasn't just a technical mistake, it was a psychological trap. If Asia was huge and the ocean was small, then sailing west from Europe to reach the riches of the East wasn't just possible, it was easy. This short-distance illusion would eventually become the foundation of Christopher Columbus's sales pitch. He used Polo's inflated distances to argue that the trip to Japan would be a short, pleasant jaunt across the water. But there was another type of lie creeping into the maps of this era: phantom islands. As sailors began to poke their heads out into the Atlantic, they often suffered from optical illusions, or perhaps they simply lied to get more funding for future voyages. Maps began to feature islands like Antillia or the Isle of St. Brendan. Some maps even showed High Brasil, a circular island off the coast of Ireland that was said to be hidden in fog except for one day every 7 years. These islands weren't real, but they stayed on official maps for centuries. Why? Because in the world of early cartography, it was safer to keep a fake island on a map than to remove a real one and cause a shipwreck. These ghosts of the sea filled the empty spaces of the Atlantic, giving explorers a false sense of security. They believed the ocean was dotted with stepping stones that would allow them to rest on their way to the gold of Japan. The maps of the late 14th century were a chaotic blend of Polo's grand exaggerations, ancient Greek math, and sailors' tall tales. They depicted a world that was crowded, reachable, and profitable. The fear of the Sea of Darkness was being replaced by the greed for spice and silk. But as the ships grew stronger and the compass became common, the gap between the map and reality was about to hit a breaking point. The world was about to be discovered, but only because the maps were so incredibly colonially wrong. As the 15th century dawned, the center of gravity for exploration shifted to the rugged Atlantic coast of Portugal. While the rest of Europe was still staring at maps filled with religious symbols and Marco Polo's fantasies, a prince named Henry, later known as the Navigator, turned his kingdom into a top-secret laboratory for maritime intelligence. The Portuguese realized something that would change history. Knowledge of the map was the ultimate power,
and a map that showed the way to gold was a state secret worth more than any army. At the time, the southern edge of the world was a wall of fear. Most maps, still influenced by Ptolemy, showed Africa as a landmass that never ended, or worse, one that curved back to join Asia, making the Indian Ocean a landlocked lake. Sailors believed that if they sailed too far south, the sun would become a giant furnace, the water would boil, and their skin would turn black from the heat. The Portuguese School of Sagres set out to dismantle these myths with cold, hard data. Prince Henry began sending expeditions down the coast of West Africa. Each captain was ordered to go just a little further than the last and, crucially, to bring back precise measurements. This was the birth of the Portolan chart. Unlike the beautiful, artistic maps of the past, Portolan charts were gritty and functional. They were covered in rhumb lines, a web of crisscrossing lines that allowed sailors to navigate using a compass. They didn't care about the Garden of Eden or the location of monsters. They cared about the jagged reality of the coastline. However, as the Portuguese pushed south, they encountered a terrifying geographical reality that no map had predicted: the South Atlantic Gyre. The winds and currents off the coast of Africa actually pushed ships away from the continent and back toward the middle of the ocean. To go south, you had to sail west, away from the land into the terrifying unknown, and then loop back. This maneuver, called the Volta do Mar, required a level of trust in mathematics that most sailors didn't have. They were literally sailing into a void on the map to find a way around a continent that wasn't supposed to have an end. The Portuguese maps of this era were shrouded in the policy of silence. To leak a map to a rival nation like Spain or Venice was a crime punishable by death. They were creating clandestine maps that showed the African coast opening up, proving that Ptolemy was wrong. Africa did not go on forever. There was a way around. In 1488, Bartolomeu Diaz finally reached the southern tip of Africa. He called it the Cape of Storms, but King John II renamed it the Cape of Good Hope because it proved that the Indian Ocean was open. But even this victory was recorded with a massive error. When Diaz looked out at the vast ocean beyond the Cape, he had no idea how large the Earth actually was. The Portuguese still believed the world was much smaller than it is, which led to a dangerous overconfidence. Meanwhile, this Portuguese secrecy drove other explorers to desperation. A Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus had been watching the Portuguese closely. He had seen their secret charts and heard the rumors of the African coast, but Columbus had a different theory. He believed the Portuguese were wasting their time going around Africa. Based on a cocktail of Ptolemy's shrunken earth, Marco Polo's stretched Asia, and his own religious delusions, he calculated that the distance from Spain to Japan was only 2,400 miles. In reality, it was over 12,000 miles. This was the most productive error in human history. Columbus's map was a masterpiece of wishful thinking. He had mathematically deleted the Pacific Ocean and the entire continent of North and South America from existence. He convinced the Spanish crown that the world was small enough for a tiny wooden ship to cross in a few weeks. The Portuguese laughed at him, not because they thought the world was flat, but because their superior maps told them the Earth was much larger than Columbus claimed. They knew he would run out of food and water long before he hit Asia. What they didn't know was that a new world was sitting in the middle of the Atlantic, waiting to catch him. The race for the Cape of Good Hope had accidentally set the stage for a collision with a world that wasn't on a map.
In the late summer of 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail with 3 ships and a map that was essentially a work of fiction. He wasn't looking for a new world. He was looking for a shortcut to the paycheck of a lifetime. His maps,
Heavily influenced by the Florentine cosmographer Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, showed the Atlantic Ocean as a manageable stretch of water dotted with mythical islands like Antillia, which could serve as pit stops. According to his calculations, Japan should have been exactly where the Caribbean islands are today. The voyage was a psychological battle against the map. As the days turned into weeks and the horizon remained empty, the crew began to panic. They weren't afraid of falling off the edge of the world. They were afraid of the math. They knew that if the distance was as great as the Portuguese scientists had warned, they would starve to death before seeing land. Columbus, in an act of desperate manipulation, kept 2 logs, one for himself with the true distance and a fake one for the crew that showed they had traveled less than they actually had. He was lying to his men because his map was lying to him. When Columbus finally hit land in the Bahamas, his map told him exactly what he wanted to see. He didn't see a new continent, he saw the outskirts of Asia. When he encountered the indigenous people, he called them Indians because, according to his chart, he was in the East Indies. When he found Cuba, he was convinced it was the mainland of China. He even sent an embassy into the jungle to find the Great Khan, carrying letters from the Spanish monarchs. They found a small village of huts, but Columbus's brain was so tethered to his incorrect maps that he simply assumed the great cities were just a few miles further inland. This was the beginning of the Great Map Overlay. For years, explorers tried to force the geography of the Americas into the pre-existing mold of Asia. They were like people trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, except the peg was a whole new hemisphere. This led to some of the most bizarre map-making in history. Maps from the early 1500s often show the West Indies floating just off the coast of China, or North America depicted as a thin peninsula attached to the top of Russia. The man who finally broke this delusion was Amerigo Vespucci. While Columbus died still believing he had reached Asia, Vespucci looked at the coastlines of South America and realized the scale didn't match. The plants were different, the stars in the southern sky were different, and the sheer length of the coastline suggested something massive. He wrote a letter titled Mundus Novus, New World. He realized that Ptolemy, the Bible, and Marco Polo had all missed something, an entire half of the planet. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller was working on a new world map. He had read Vespucci's accounts and decided to do something revolutionary. He drew a map that showed a separate landmass in the west, detached from Asia, surrounded by water. Across this new land, he printed the name America, in honor of Amerigo. It was a landmark moment, but the map was still hilariously wrong. It showed North and South America as thin, spindly strips of land. More importantly, it showed a massive, wide-open ocean between America and Asia. Waldseemüller had guessed that the Pacific Ocean existed, but he had no idea it was the largest feature on the planet. He drew it as a narrow sea. This new map solved one mystery, but created a deadlier one. If America was a separate continent, then there must be a way through it or around it to get to the real Asia. This sparked a 300-year obsession with finding the Northwest Passage, a mythical water route through the frozen north. Hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors would eventually die in the ice, chasing a blue line on a map that existed only in the imagination of cartographers who couldn't accept that the world was much larger and more difficult than they had ever dreamed. By 1519, the map of the world looked like a half-finished puzzle. The Atlantic was mapped, and the New World was an established barrier, but the space beyond America was a total mystery, a literal Pacific vacuum. Cartographers, still clinging to the idea that the Earth was smaller than it actually was, drew a narrow strip of water between America and Asia. They assumed a ship could cross it in a few days. This was the most lethal error in the history of navigation, and it was about to be corrected by the blood of Ferdinand Magellan's crew.
Magellan, a Portuguese navigator working for Spain, set out with 5 ships to find a way around America. He was armed with a secret map he had seen in the Portuguese archives, which suggested there was a strait, a passage, through the southern part of the continent. But when he reached South America, the map failed him. The strait he thought he found was actually the mouth of the massive Rio de la Plata. He wasted weeks sailing inland, only to find the water turning fresh. The map was a lie. He pushed further south into the freezing, jagged unknown. Eventually, he found the tortuous, 350-mile labyrinth now known as the Strait of Magellan. It took 38 days of terrifying navigation through narrow channels where the winds could flip a ship in seconds. When he finally emerged into the open sea on the other side, the water was so calm he named it Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. Now the map error turned deadly. According to the best charts of the time, the trip across this new ocean to the Spice Islands should have taken about 2 or 3 weeks. Magellan and his men thought they were almost there. Instead, they sailed for 3 months and 20 days without seeing a single speck of inhabited land. The Pacific Ocean was not a narrow sea. It was a monster that covered 1/3 of the entire planet. It was larger than all the Earth's land masses combined. The maps had shrunk the Pacific by thousands of miles. As the weeks turned into months, the horror set in. The crew ran out of fresh food. They began eating sawdust, leather hides from the ship's rigging, and rats, which became a luxury item sold for half a gold crown. Scurvy began to rot their gums and reopen old wounds. Because the map said the ocean was small, they hadn't packed nearly enough supplies for the reality of the Pacific. When they finally hit the Philippines, Magellan was killed in a local skirmish, but one ship, the Victoria, eventually made it back to Spain. Out of the 270 men who started the journey, only 18 returned. They were walking skeletons, but they had accomplished the impossible. They had circumnavigated the globe. This voyage fundamentally broke the old world maps forever. It proved that the Earth was vastly larger than Ptolemy or Columbus had ever dreamed. It proved that the New World wasn't just a bump in the road to Asia, but a massive continent separated from the East by a gargantuan, terrifying ocean. However, even as the true size of the world was revealed, mapmakers couldn't stop themselves from inventing new fantasies. If there was that much water in the north, they reasoned, there must be a massive continent in the south to balance the weight of the Earth. This gave rise to the myth of Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. For the next 200 years, maps would show a giant, continent-sized landmass at the bottom of the world, often depicted with lush forests and civilizations. This wasn't Antarctica. It was a ghost continent created by a mathematical theory about balance. The Pacific was no longer a vacuum, but the maps were still filled with holes. And as the Spanish and Portuguese began to rake in gold, a new power was rising in the north, the Dutch, who would turn map-making into the world's most profitable and most beautiful corporate secret.
By the mid-16th century, the world was finally known to be a sphere, but this created a mathematical nightmare for sailors. Think about it. How do you take the surface of a round ball and flatten it onto a square piece of paper without tearing or stretching the truth? If you peel an orange and try to flatten the skin, it rips. If you stretch it, the shapes of the continents change. For centuries, navigators struggled with rhumb lines that looked straight on a map but actually led them in dangerous curves across the ocean. Enter Gerardus Mercator. In 1569, this Flemish cartographer released a map that would become the most influential and most controversial image of the world ever created. Mercator's goal wasn't to show what the world looked like to an astronaut. He wanted to create a mathematical cheat code for sailors. He developed a projection where lines of constant bearing, loxodromes, were represented as straight lines. If a captain wanted to sail from Lisbon to New York, he could simply draw a straight line on a Mercator map, follow his compass, and he would arrive.
It was a stroke of genius for navigation, but it came with a heavy price: the Great Distortion. To make the navigation line straight, Mercator had to stretch the map toward the poles. The further you moved away from the equator, the larger the land masses became. This created a visual lie that has warped our perception of the world for over 450 years. On a Mercator map, Greenland looks roughly the same size as Africa. In reality, Africa is 14 times larger than Greenland. You could fit Greenland, the United States, China, India, and most of Europe inside Africa, yet the map makes the northern imperial powers look like giants and the tropical nations look like ants. This wasn't an intentional political conspiracy by Mercator. He was solving a math problem. But the map was quickly adopted by European empires. They loved it because it made Europe look massive and centrally located. It gave a visual right to colonial expansion. When a child in a U.S. classroom looks at a wall map today, they are likely still looking at a version of Mercator's 1569 projection. We have been raised with a Eurocentric view of the world scale simply because of a 16th century navigation hack. While Mercator was fixing the math, other map makers were still struggling with the ghosts of the map. This was the era of the island of California. In the early 1600s, a Spanish map was published showing California not as a peninsula, but as a massive island separated from North America by a fictional Sea of California. Despite numerous explorers reporting that it was definitely part of the mainland, the island of California error was so popular that it persisted on official maps for over a century. Even King Ferdinand VI of Spain had to eventually issue a royal decree in 1747 stating California is not an island, just to get map makers to stop drawing it that way. The 16th and 17th centuries were a tug of war between the new precision of math and the old habits of imagination. Maps were becoming more beautiful than ever, decorated with sea monsters, elaborate compass roses, and wind heads blowing from the corners. But the monsters were moving. As the centers of the oceans were explored, the sea serpents were pushed to the edges, to the Arctic and the deep south. Mapmakers were starting to realize that white space on a map was a sign of honesty, but the public hated white space. They wanted a full world. So cartographers continued to fill the gaps with the Terra Australis Incognita, that massive, hypothetical southern continent. They were certain it was there, they just hadn't hit it yet. The world was now a grid of latitude and longitude, a cage of math. But inside that cage, giant phantoms still roamed the uncharted seas. The next great challenge wasn't just knowing where you were, it was knowing when you were. To truly fix the map, humanity would have to solve the greatest scientific mystery of the age, the problem of longitude.
By the 1700s, the world's coastlines were taking shape on paper, but there was an invisible, deadly flaw in every map. Nobody knew exactly where they were from east to west. Determining latitude, how far north or south you are, was easy. You just measured the angle of the sun or the North Star. But longitude, how far east or west you are, was a nightmare. Because the Earth rotates, time and distance are linked. To know your longitude, you needed to know the exact time at a home port and compare it to the local time on your ship. The problem? In the 18th century, clocks didn't work at sea. The rocking of the ship, the humidity, and the changes in temperature caused pendulum clocks to swing wildly or stop altogether. This wasn't just a technicality, it was a death sentence. Without accurate longitude, maps were essentially best guesses. Captains would use dead reckoning, which involved throwing a log tied to a rope into the water to guess their speed. If they miscalculated by even a tiny fraction, they would find themselves miles away from where the map said they were, often smashing into rocks they thought were leagues away. The most famous disaster occurred in 1707 when a British fleet under Admiral Shovel hit the Scilly Isles near England.
They thought they were in the safe, open water of the English Channel, but their maps and their dead reckoning were off. 2,000 men drowned in a single night. This tragedy forced the British Parliament to pass the Longitude Act, offering a king's ransom of £20,000, millions in today's money, to anyone who could solve the longitude problem. The scientific elite, including Sir Isaac Newton, believed the answer lay in the stars. They spent decades trying to map the lunar distance method, a complex system of measuring the moon's position against the stars. It required hours of math and a library of books. It was a map of the sky to fix the map of the Earth. But a humble, self-taught carpenter and clockmaker named John Harrison had a different idea. He believed he could build a clock that could keep perfect time in the middle of a hurricane. For 40 years, Harrison fought the scientific establishment. He built 4 different versions of his marine chronometer, each more compact than the last. His final version, the H4, was a large pocket watch that changed everything. On a voyage to Jamaica, Harrison's watch was off by only 5 seconds after 81 days at sea. For the first time in human history, a navigator could look at his watch, look at his map, and know exactly where he was. This changed map-making from an art of estimation to a science of precision. Maps were no longer filled with estimated distances between continents. The gaps between Europe, Africa, and the Americas were finally measured with surgical accuracy. The shrunken or bloated oceans of the past were corrected. However, even as the where was being solved, there was still a what that haunted the maps. While the Atlantic was now precisely measured, the Great Southern Ocean was still a blank canvas. Cartographers were still drawing the massive mythical continent of Terra Australis Incognita on the bottom of their maps, insisting it must be there to balance the world. The world had the clocks to find the land. It now just needed a man brave enough or obsessed enough to go to the one place the maps said existed, but no one had ever seen. That man was Captain James Cook, and his mission would finally erase the last great lie of the ancient mapmakers.
By the 1770s, the maps of the world were nearly complete, save for one massive, tantalizing blank space. For nearly 2,000 years, as we've seen, the ghost continent of Terra Australis Incognita had haunted the bottom of every globe. Philosophers argued that without a massive southern landmass to balance the weight of Europe and Asia, the Earth would literally tip over in space. Mapmakers, refusing to leave the space empty, drew a lush, fertile continent that stretched from the South Pole almost up to the equator. Captain James Cook, a man of cold logic and unparalleled maritime skill, was the man chosen by the British Admiralty to find this southern paradise or prove it was a myth. Armed with the new precision of John Harrison's chronometer and an obsession with scientific accuracy, Cook set out on his second voyage in 1772. His mission was simple but brutal: sail as far south as possible and circumnavigate the globe at the highest latitude manageable. As Cook pushed further south than any human in history, the lush paradise promised by the maps began to melt away, replaced by a nightmare of ice and fog. Instead of the forests and civilizations depicted in the atlases, Cook found islands of ice as tall as ships' masts and a sea so cold it froze the rigging solid. He crossed the Antarctic Circle 3 times, becoming the first person to do so. He sailed thousands of miles through the very territory where the maps said a continent should be, but he found nothing but a desolate, frozen void. Cook's journals from this period are a eulogy for a 2,000-year-old error. He wrote, "If there is a southern continent, it must be a country doomed by nature to everlasting frigidness." He didn't just find a new place, he deleted a fake one. When Cook returned to England, the great ghost continent was scrubbed from the maps.
The lush, populated landmass that had appeared in Ptolemy's sketches and Mercator's projections was officially dead. In its place, mapmakers were forced to leave a vast, white, terrifying blank, what would eventually be identified as the actual, frozen Antarctica. But Cook's work did more than just delete a continent. It perfected the shape of the Pacific. He mapped the islands of Hawaii, the east coast of Australia, and New Zealand with such precision that his charts remained in use for over 100 years. For the first time, the hallucination of geography was over. The world on the paper finally matched the world of dirt and water. However, as the outer world became clear, a new kind of error began to emerge. With the oceans conquered, the great powers turned their gaze inland. The coastlines were now accurate, but the interiors of Africa, North America, and Central Asia were still mysteries. And in these gaps, mapmakers began to commit a different kind of sin: political cartography. If they didn't know what was in the center of a continent, they didn't leave it blank anymore. They drew mountains where there were plains and rivers that flowed uphill, all to justify colonial borders. The wrongness of maps was shifting from a lack of scientific knowledge to a tool of deliberate deception and imperial greed. The monsters weren't in the sea anymore. They were in the boardrooms where the maps were being redrawn to carve up the world.
By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the outlines of the continents were finally set in stone, but the interiors remained a white canvas of mystery. In Africa, particularly, the coast was well known to European traders, but the heart of the continent was a blank space. However, mapmakers of this era suffered from horror vacui, a fear of empty spaces. They believed a map with a hole in the middle looked unprofessional, so they began to fill the center of Africa with one of the most successful geographical hoaxes in history: the Mountains of Kong. In 1798, an English cartographer named James Rennell was tasked with mapping the discoveries of the explorer Mungo Park. Park had seen some small hills near the Niger River, but Rennell, sitting in a comfortable office in London, decided to turn those hills into a massive, impenetrable mountain range. He drew a jagged line of peaks stretching thousands of miles across West Africa, from the Atlantic to the Mountains of the Moon in the east. He called them the Mountains of Kong. For the next 90 years, the Mountains of Kong appeared on almost every official map of Africa. They weren't just a minor error, they changed the course of history. Because these mountains were depicted as a massive, snow-capped wall, explorers and merchants believed that the interior of Africa was impossible to reach from the coast. It stalled exploration for nearly a century. If the map said there was a 10,000-foot wall of rock in your way, you didn't pack your bags to go see for yourself. The Mountains of Kong were a cartographic virus. Once one prestigious mapmaker drew them, everyone else copied them to avoid looking less informed. This highlights a fundamental truth about why early maps were so wrong: plagiarism. Mapmaking was an expensive, labor-intensive business. It was much easier to copy a famous map than to hire an explorer to verify the data. In this way, a single man's imagination could become an objective fact for generations. It wasn't until the late 1880s that a French explorer named Louis Gustave Binger actually traveled to the region where the mountains were supposed to be. He found nothing, just a few rolling hills and flat plains. He wrote back to Paris with the shocking news: the most prominent feature on the map of Africa didn't exist. The Mountains of Kong were a phantom of the ink. While the Mountains of Kong were an accidental error born of ego, other map lies of the 19th century were far more sinister. This was the era of the scramble for Africa and the great game in Central Asia. European powers began using maps as weapons of war. They would draw spheres of influence over lands they had never even stepped foot on.
They created straight-line borders that ignored the reality of the ground. Mountains, rivers, and tribal territories were erased in favor of clean geometric lines that looked good on a map in London or Berlin office. These maps were wrong in a new, modern way. They weren't wrong because of a lack of technology. They were wrong because they were designed to serve an agenda. They depicted the world not as it was, but as empires wanted it to be. This period saw the rise of thematic mapping, where maps were used to show population, resources, and even racial superiority. The map was no longer a guide for the traveler, it was a blueprint for the conqueror. As we moved into the 20th century, the era of the gentleman explorer was coming to an end. The invention of the airplane and the camera was about to do something that centuries of ships and clocks couldn't. It was going to strip away the final hiding places of the mapmaker's imagination. The world was about to be seen from above, and the transition would be both beautiful and brutal.
By the early 1900s, mapmakers thought they had finally won. The ghost continents were gone, the longitude problem was solved, and the mountains of Kong had been scrubbed away. But there was still a massive, nagging problem: the ground level bias. Even with the best tools, a mapmaker on the ground is like an ant trying to map a rug. They can see the threads, but they can't see the pattern. To truly fix the map, humanity needed to leave the surface of the Earth. The shift began in the most unlikely of places, the basket of a hot air balloon. In the mid-19th century, photographers like Gaspard Félix Tournachon, known as Nadar, began taking cameras into the sky over Paris. The first results were shaky and blurred, but they revealed something shocking. The maps of Paris, which had been refined for centuries, were slightly off. Streets weren't as straight as the ink suggested, and the rectangles of city blocks were actually irregular trapezoids. The eye in the sky proved that human mapmakers had been subconsciously cleaning up reality for centuries. Then came World War I, and the map became a matter of life and death on an industrial scale. In the muddy hell of the trenches, knowing the exact location of an enemy battery or a hidden bunker was the difference between victory and a massacre. This sparked the birth of modern photogrammetry, the science of making maps from photographs. Pilots flew flimsy biplanes over no man's land, snapping thousands of overlapping photos. Back at headquarters, stereo plotters would overlap these images to create three-dimensional maps of the terrain. For the first time, maps showed the world in all its messy, jagged glory. We discovered that rivers we thought were straight actually meandered like coiled snakes. We found that flat plains were actually filled with hidden ridges and dips. The aerial camera didn't care about aesthetic beauty or colonial borders, it only cared about the truth of the light. But this new technology revealed a final, humbling error. Even when we looked down from 2 miles up, we were still getting the edges wrong. The Earth isn't a perfect sphere, it's an oblate spheroid. It bulges at the middle like a squashed orange. This meant that the farther a map spanned, the more the math started to break. Even our best aerial maps were still just 2D representations of a 3D wobbling ball. The early 20th century was a period of the Great Correction. Every map in the world had to be redrawn. This was the era of the Great Trigonometrical Survey, where teams spent decades lugging massive theodolites to the tops of the Himalayas just to verify what the cameras were seeing. They discovered that even the tallest mountain in the world, Mount Everest, wasn't where the map said it was miles away, and its height had been miscalculated because the gravity of the mountains themselves was pulling on the surveyor's instruments. As we moved into the 1940s and 50s, the map was no longer just a drawing, it was a data set. But we were still limited by the atmosphere. We could see the land, but we couldn't see the whole land at once. And more importantly, we still had no idea what was happening under the oceans. We had mapped the moon with better accuracy than the bottom of our own Atlantic.
The next frontier wouldn't just take us higher, it would take us into the deep, dark blue, where the final and most shocking geographical errors were waiting to be unmasked. For most of human history, the bottom of the ocean was the ultimate blank space. Even as we perfected the maps of the continents, we treated the sea as a featureless blue bathtub. Early map makers assumed the seafloor was a flat, muddy plain, a graveyard for shipwrecks and ancient monsters. It was the last great hallucination of geography. We knew more about the surface of Mars than we did about the 70% of our own planet that lay beneath the waves. The first major attempt to look down happened in the mid-19th century, but it was primitive. Sailors would drop a lead line, a heavy weight on a rope, until it hit the bottom. This was point-to-point mapping, and it was agonizingly slow. If you were a mile away from a mountain peak on the seafloor, you would never know it was there. You were essentially trying to map the Grand Canyon by dropping a string from a balloon in the middle of a thick fog. The real breakthrough came during World War II with the invention of sonar, sound navigation and ranging. Developed to hunt for silent German U-boats, sonar used sound pulses that bounced off the bottom and returned to the ship. Suddenly, we weren't just guessing, we were seeing with sound. But the data was top-secret military intelligence. It wasn't until after the war that a brilliant, often overlooked woman named Marie Tharp began to turn those sound pings into the most revolutionary map of the 20th century. Working at Columbia University, Tharp was banned from going on the research ships because women were considered bad luck at sea. Instead, she stayed in a dusty office, taking the raw sonar data brought back by her partner, Bruce Heezen, and painstakingly plotting it by hand. As she connected the dots, a shocking reality emerged. The seafloor wasn't flat. It was a jagged, mountainous landscape with peaks higher than the Himalayas and canyons deeper than the Andes. But Tharp found something even more controversial. In the middle of the Atlantic, she discovered a massive, continuous rift, a V-shaped valley that ran down the center of a giant underwater mountain range. She realized this was evidence of continental drift, the theory that the continents were moving. At the time, this was scientific heresy. Her partner, Heezen, dismissed her discovery as girl talk. It took years of meticulous mapping to prove she was right. Her 1977 map, the World Ocean Floor Panorama, changed everything. It revealed the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a 10,000-mile-long volcanic mountain range that proved the Earth was alive and shifting. The wrongness of our previous maps wasn't just about missing islands, it was about a fundamental misunderstanding of how the planet worked. We had been drawing the continents as static, unmoving pieces of a puzzle, when in reality, they were passengers on a conveyor belt of tectonic plates. Mapping the abyss didn't just fill in the blue spaces, it gave us the why behind geography. We finally understood why earthquakes happen where they do, and why mountains rise. But as we conquered the depths, a new revolution was brewing above us. We were about to launch artificial stars into the sky that would take the pen out of human hands forever. The era of the map was ending, and the era of the system was about to begin.
By the 1950s, the map was no longer a tool for merchants or explorers. It had become the ultimate weapon of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a nuclear standoff, and for the first time in history, the wrongness of a map could trigger the end of civilization. To aim an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, from a silo in Montana to a target in Moscow, you needed more than just a general idea of where the cities were. You needed to know the distance down to the foot. The problem was that even in 1960, we still didn't have a perfectly unified map of the world. Each continent had its own datum, a mathematical starting point for its maps. Because the oceans were so vast, the North American map and the European map didn't actually line up. They were like two separate puzzles that didn't quite fit together. If you tried to bridge them with math, you could be off by several hundred meters. In a world of nuclear warheads, several hundred meters was the difference between hitting a military base and hitting a city center. To fix this, we needed to go higher than any airplane could fly. We needed to look at the Earth from space. In 1960, the U.S. launched the first of the Corona satellites. These were top-secret spy cameras that orbited the Earth, took photos on actual film, and then dropped the canisters back into the atmosphere to be caught by planes in mid-air. When those first photos were developed, the God's Eye view revealed that the Soviet Union's own maps were deliberately wrong. The Soviets had been practicing cartographic disinformation. They moved cities, changed the names of towns, and bent the lines of roads on their public maps to confuse potential invaders. They even created ghost cities that didn't exist. But the satellite didn't care about the labels. It saw the heat, the concrete, and the steel. For the first time, the map of reality and the map of paper were being reconciled by machines. This era also saw the birth of the World Geodetic System, WGS. To make maps truly accurate, scientists had to measure the Earth's gravity from space. They discovered that the Earth isn't just a squashed orange, it's lumpy. Gravity is stronger in some places than others, causing the sea level to actually bulge or dip by hundreds of feet. This geoid meant that our traditional maps, which assumed a smooth curve, were fundamentally flawed. The solution arrived in the 1970s with the development of the Global Positioning System, GPS. Originally a military project designed to guide missiles, GPS relied on a constellation of satellites carrying atomic clocks. It was John Harrison's longitude solution, but on a cosmic scale. Instead of one clock on a ship, we now had dozens of clocks in orbit, constantly whispering the exact time down to the Earth. When GPS was eventually opened to the public, it did something radical. It killed the paper map. For thousands of years, the map was a static object you held in your hands. It was a snapshot of the past. But with GPS and the rise of Geographic Information Systems, GIS, the map became a living, breathing, digital organism. It could see traffic, it could see weather, and it could see you. However, this transition created a new, subtle error. As we outsourced our sense of direction to the blue dot on our phones, we began to lose our mental map of the world. We became technically perfect, but geographically blind. We could navigate to a coffee shop with inch-perfect accuracy, yet many of us could no longer point to where we were on a globe. The wrongness of the past was born of ignorance. The wrongness of the future was beginning to look like a loss of connection.
We now live in the age of the perfect map. With a flick of a thumb, we can zoom from a view of the entire planet down to the very shingles on our own roof. Google Maps, Apple Maps, and Waze have eliminated the terror of getting lost. But as the map moved from parchment to pixels, a new and stranger kind of error emerged. In the digital age, maps are no longer just reflecting reality. They are actively creating it. This has led to the bizarre phenomenon of paper towns and trap streets. For decades, map-making companies have lived in fear of their work being stolen. If a company spends millions of dollars surveying a city, what's to stop a competitor from simply tracing their map and selling it as their own? To catch these thieves, cartographers began planting map traps. They would invent a tiny, non-existent street, a fake cul-de-sac, or a town that didn't exist, and hide it in their data. If that fake street appeared on someone else's map, they had caught them in the act of plagiarism. One of the most famous examples is the town of Agloe, New York. In the 1930s, the General Drafting Company invented Agloe as a copyright trap at a dirt road intersection in the Catskill Mountains. Decades later, Agloe appeared on other maps, including those from the prestigious Rand McNally. But then something surreal happened. Because people saw Agloe on the map, they went there looking for it. A local businessman, seeing the name on his map, built the Agloe General Store.
Soon, the state government recognized the town. A map error had literally willed a town into existence. In the digital world, these hallucinations have become even high stakes. In 2010, a border dispute between Nicaragua and Costa Rica nearly turned into a war because of a mistake on Google Maps. A Nicaraguan commander noticed that Google Maps showed a disputed piece of land as belonging to Nicaragua, even though official treaties said otherwise. He used the Google Map error as a legal justification to lead troops across the border and plant a flag. The world realized that in the 21st century, people trust the blue dot on their phones more than they trust international law. This highlights the digital mirage, the belief that because a map looks high-tech, it must be 100% accurate. We see this in death by GPS incidents, where travelers in the U.S. Southwest follow digital maps onto ghost roads in the desert, roads that might have existed in 1920 but are now nothing but sand and rocks. Because the digital map says turn left, people drive straight into the wilderness, assuming the machine knows something they don't. We have also entered the era of algorithmic erasure. Digital maps today are designed to show us what we want to buy, not just where we are. If you search for a city on a digital map, the POIs, or points of interest, that pop up are often dictated by advertising and data. A historic landmark might be invisible, while a new Starbucks is highlighted in bright colors. The wrongness of the modern map is no longer about missing continents, it's about a distorted priority. The map is being optimized, and in that optimization, the true character of the landscape is often lost. As we look toward the future, the map is moving beyond the screen. We are building digital twins of the entire planet, real-time 3D models used by self-driving cars and drones. But as we strive for total accuracy, we are discovering that the more data we add, the more ghosts we create in the machine. The final frontier of mapping isn't just about where things are, it's about how we define reality in a world where the map is more powerful than the territory it represents. For centuries, the wrongness of maps was something we blamed on human error, bad math, wild imaginations, or primitive tools. But in the 21st century, we are facing a terrifying new reality. The maps are becoming wrong because the Earth itself is changing faster than we can print the ink. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Arctic. For hundreds of years, the Northwest Passage was a cartographic myth that lured sailors to their deaths in the ice. Today, that passage is becoming a blue reality, and it's making our existing maps obsolete. The Arctic has always been a nightmare for cartographers. Because the Mercator projection stretches the poles so drastically, the top of the world always looks like a massive, distorted crown of white. But as global temperatures rise, the permanent ice shelves that were drawn as solid land masses on 20th century maps are disintegrating. In Russia and Canada, entire coastlines are retreating by dozens of feet every year as the permafrost melts. If you use a map from the 1990s to navigate the Siberian coast today, you might find yourself sailing through what the map insists is solid ground. But the most mysterious errors of the modern Arctic involve ghost islands. In 1931, Soviet pilots mapped a series of islands off the coast of Siberia. For decades, they appeared on every official world atlas. However, when modern researchers returned with satellite imagery, the islands were gone. They hadn't sunk, they were ice islands, massive blocks of dirt and gravel held together by ancient ice. As the ice melted, the islands simply dissolved into the sea. We are the first generation of humans to see islands literally unexist from the map. This vanishing geography has triggered a new high-stakes race for the North Pole. Because the ice is melting, the seafloor and the trillions of dollars in oil and gas beneath it is finally accessible. Countries like Russia, Denmark, and the United States are now engaged in cartographic warfare. They are sending submersibles to the bottom of the ocean to plant flags and prove that underwater ridges connect to their continental shelves. They are trying to use the maps of Marie Tharp to claim territory that was once buried under 2 miles of ice. This highlights a new kind of map error, the static fallacy. We have always treated maps as a final record of a finished world. We assume that once a mountain is mapped, it stays mapped. But we are moving into an era of fluid geography. In the Amazon, rivers change their course so frequently that satellite maps have to be updated weekly to keep river pilots from running aground. In the Pacific, rising sea levels are threatening to swallow nations like Kiribati and the Maldives. Soon, we will have maps of countries that no longer have any land. The maps of the future won't be about where things are, they will be about where things were and where they are going. We are transitioning from the map of space to the map of time. As the climate shifts, the errors in our maps are no longer just mistakes of the past, they are warnings of the future. The white spaces are returning to the map, but this time they aren't filled with monsters or gold, they are filled with the blue water of a changing planet. As we struggle to keep up with a melting world, the next frontier of mapping is moving inward. We have mapped the stars and the seafloor, but we are only just beginning to map the most complex territory of all, the invisible networks that connect our digital lives.
By the second decade of the 21st century, we had reached a strange milestone. The physical world was almost perfectly mapped, yet the world we actually inhabited for 8 hours a day, the digital world, was a complete mystery. We think of the internet as a cloud, a vague, ethereal space floating above us, but the internet has a physical geography that is just as real and just as full of errors as the maps of the ancient Greeks. If you could see the map of the internet, it would look like a sprawling, glowing nervous system, and its continents would be the massive data centers buried in the hills of Virginia or the deserts of Iceland. The most critical parts of this map are the submarine cables. Over 95% of all international data doesn't travel through satellites, it travels through fiber optic cables on the ocean floor, some no thicker than a garden hose. These cables follow the same routes as the old Spanish galleons and the 19th century telegraph lines. We have essentially laid a 21st century digital map directly over a 16th century trade map. This creates a cartography of vulnerability. A single anchor dragged by a fishing boat off the coast of Egypt can, and has, accidentally erased the internet for millions of people in India and the Middle East. But the wrongness of digital mapping today isn't about physical cables, it's about IP geolocation. When you open a website, the internet tries to guess where you are based on your IP address. This is the modern version of dead reckoning. It's often hilariously inaccurate. There's a famous case of a farm in Kansas that became a digital hell because a geolocation company picked it as the default center of the United States. Whenever the computer couldn't find a specific location for an IP address, it would just drop the pin on this poor family's farmhouse. For years, the police, private investigators, and angry debt collectors showed up at their door because the map of the internet insisted they were the source of every digital glitch in the country. We're also seeing the rise of dark mapping. Just as the Portuguese kept their 15th century charts secret to protect their gold, modern tech giants keep their internal maps hidden. Google, Apple, and Amazon possess maps of human behavior that are far more detailed than any topographic survey. They map desire paths, not just where the roads are, but where people actually walk and where they want to go. These maps predict where a riot might start, where a disease will spread, or which business will fail. This leads to a new kind of monstrous race on the map. In the Middle Ages, mapmakers drew headless men at the edges of the world. Today, the edges of our digital maps are data deserts, neighborhoods or rural areas that are deemed unprofitable by algorithms. If an area isn't mapped by delivery apps or ride-sharing services, it effectively ceases to exist in the modern economy.
People living in these digital blanks find that they can't get insurance, can't get loans, and can't get ambulances to find their front door. The map is no longer just failing to show us the land, it is actively deciding who gets to participate in society. The wrongness has shifted from a lack of information to an excess of filter. We are no longer looking at a map of the world, we are looking at a map of our world, tailored to our browsing history and our bank account. The dream of a universal map that everyone shares is dying, replaced by billions of individual, personalized hallucinations. As we move deeper into this digital frontier, we are beginning to realize that the most important territory left to map isn't the Earth at all. It's the human brain and the way we perceive space. The next chapter of our story takes us into the mind, where the oldest maps of all are still being drawn.
For all our talk of satellites, lasers, and silicon chips, the most sophisticated map in existence isn't stored on a server in Silicon Valley. It's housed between your ears. For decades, scientists wondered how humans and animals could navigate across thousands of miles without a compass or a piece of parchment. How does a bird find a specific tree in the Amazon after flying from Canada? How did the Polynesians navigate the vastness of the Pacific without a single instrument? The answer lies in a biological marvel called the cognitive map. In the 1970s, researchers discovered place cells in the hippocampus, a tiny seahorse-shaped part of the brain. These are neurons that fire only when you're in a specific location. Later, they found grid cells, which act like a built-in coordinate system, allowing your brain to track your movement across a mental latitude and longitude. We are born with a biological version of the Mercator projection, a mental software that constantly updates our position in space. But here is where the wrongness returns. Our internal maps are not objective, they are emotional and distorted. To your brain, a mile spent walking through a dark, scary forest feels much longer than a mile spent walking toward a favorite restaurant. This is known as time-space compression. We don't map the world in inches, we map it in effort and significance. This is why early maps often showed a king's castle as massive and a peasant's village as a tiny dot. Those ancient cartographers weren't just bad at math, they were drawing the world exactly how the human brain perceives it, with the important things looming large and the unimportant things shrinking away. However, we are currently living through a massive neurological mapping crisis. Because we have outsourced our navigation to GPS, the place cells in our brains are starting to atrophy. Studies have shown that London taxi drivers, who famously must memorize the knowledge of 25,000 streets, have significantly larger hippocampi than the average person. But as we follow the blue dot on our phones, we stop building mental maps. We become GPS clones, moving through space without actually perceiving it. We are becoming lost in a way our ancestors never were, not because we don't know where we are, but because we no longer understand the relationship between point A and point B. This neurological shift is creating a new kind of geographical error, the loss of context. When you look at a paper map, you see the whole world and your tiny place in it. When you look at a phone, you are always the center of the world. The map moves around you. This egocentric mapping reinforces the oldest error in history, the Babylonian belief that we are the center of the universe. It makes us more efficient at finding a Starbucks, but worse at understanding the scale and majesty of the planet. As we move toward the end of our journey, we have to ask, if our brains are changing and our digital maps are becoming perfect, what is left to discover? The answer lies not on Earth, but in the final, ultimate white space above us. We are currently repeating every single error of the ancient mapmakers, the monsters, the myths, and the wild guesses, as we try to chart the stars. As we stand on the threshold of the 21st century, we find ourselves in a position eerily similar to the ancient Greeks. We have mastered the known world of Earth,
but we're looking out at the universe and realizing that our maps of the cosmos are filled with just as many monsters and phantom islands as the charts of the Middle Ages. The stars are our new oceans, and just like the sailors who feared the sea of darkness, we are currently staring into a void that we don't fully understand. The first great error of space mapping was the belief that the universe was static and eternal. We drew maps of the night sky as if it were a fixed ceiling, a celestial sphere. But in the 1920s, Edwin Hubble discovered that the universe is expanding. Our map of the stars isn't a drawing on a flat sheet. It's a drawing on a balloon that is being blown up. This means that every coordinate in space is moving. To map the universe, we had to invent a four-dimensional cartography where time is just as important as distance. But the most humbling realization came when we tried to measure the weight of the universe. When astronomers mapped the visible stars and galaxies, the math didn't add up. The galaxies were spinning too fast. There wasn't enough visible stuff to hold them together with gravity. To fix this gap in our knowledge, we did exactly what the medieval mapmakers did when they didn't know what was in Africa. We invented something to fill the space. We called it dark matter and dark energy. Today, our most advanced maps of the universe show that everything we can see, every star, planet, and nebula, makes up only 5% of reality. The other 95% is a map of the unknown. We are living in the ultimate white space. We have labeled it, we have theorized about it, but we have never seen it. Dark matter is the mountains of Kong of the 21st century, a placeholder for a truth we haven't yet discovered. We are also repeating the error of phantom islands in our search for exoplanets. Using the Kepler and James Webb telescopes, we map planets orbiting distant suns by watching for tiny dips in light. We draw artistic renderings of these worlds, lush green forests, deep blue oceans, and rocky peaks. But in reality, we are looking at a single pixel of light. We are mapping these worlds based on tiny fragments of data, often projecting our own hopes for life onto the cold, distant reality of space. Just as Columbus saw Japan in the bushes of the Bahamas, we are seeing Earth 2.0 in the static of a telescope. Even within our own solar system, the wrongness persists. We have mapped the surface of Mars with better resolution than the City of London, yet we are still surprised by what we find. When the New Horizons probe reached Pluto in 2015, every map we had of the dwarf planet was instantly rendered obsolete. We expected a dead, cratered rock. We found a world with beating nitrogen hearts and towering mountains of ice. The Sea of Darkness has moved from the Atlantic to the edge of our solar system. We are back to being library cartographers, sitting in our offices on Earth, trying to sketch the shapes of galaxies millions of light years away using the pings of radio telescopes. We are once again the ants on the rug trying to guess the pattern of the house. But there is a final chapter to this story. As we look outward at the stars and backward at our history of errors, we have to ask ourselves, what is the ultimate goal of the map? Is it to find our way, or is it to understand who we are?
As we look back at the 2,000-year odyssey of the map, from the clay tablets of Babylon to the glowing screens of our smartphones, we see a recurring pattern. We think we have finally conquered the wrongness. We believe that because we have satellites and atomic clocks, we finally see the world as it truly is. But if history has taught us anything, it is that every generation's perfect map becomes the next generation's beautiful lie. We are not just mapping the Earth, we are mapping the limits of our own perception. The fundamental reason maps were, and still are, so wrong is that the world is too big, too complex, and too alive to be trapped in a two-dimensional image. A map is, by definition, a simplification. To make a map that is 100% accurate, it would have to be the same size as the world itself.
As the writer Jorge Luis Borges once joked, such a map would be useless because it would cover the very land it was trying to show. Therefore, to have a map is to have an error. We choose which errors we can live with. Today, we're facing the ultimate cartographic paradox. We have more data than ever before, yet the truth of the map is harder to find. We're moving into the era of dynamic cartography, where maps are no longer objects, but living simulations. We are mapping things that are invisible: the flow of carbon dioxide through the atmosphere, the migration of microscopic plastic through the oceans, and the real-time spread of human ideas across social media. These maps don't show mountains or rivers, they show the metabolism of our planet. But even with this godlike technology, we are still prone to the same human vanities as the ancient Greeks. We still center our maps on ourselves. We still delete the parts of the world that are inconvenient or unprofitable. And we still fill the white spaces of our future, the deep oceans and the distant stars, with our own fears and fantasies. The monsters haven't disappeared, they have just moved into the algorithms. The history of maps tells us that being wrong is not a failure, it is a catalyst. If Columbus's map hadn't been wrong about the size of the Earth, he might never have had the courage to sail. If Marie Tharp hadn't seen the errors in the flat seafloor maps of her time, we might still be ignorant of how our continents move. Our mistakes are the breadcrumbs that lead us to the next great discovery. We will never be finished mapping the world, because the world is never finished changing. Islands will rise and fall, cities will grow and crumble, and our understanding of the universe will continue to expand until the maps we use today look as quaint and mythological as a Teo map from the Middle Ages. The map is not the territory. It is a bridge between the world as it is and the world as we imagine it to be. As long as there is a horizon, we will keep trying to draw what lies beyond it. We will keep getting it wrong, and in doing so, we will keep finding our way home.
Imagine waking up in a world where the horizon isn't just a line, but an edge. A world where the stars are holes in a giant velvet curtain, and the ocean doesn't lead to another continent, but spills into an infinite abyss. Before satellites, before physics, and before the first ship dared to sail past the sun's setting point, humanity lived in a masterpiece of imagination. This is the story of how we stopped seeing a flat playground and started realizing we were clinging to a giant, spinning marble lost in the cosmic dark. For the earliest civilizations, the world was not a planet, it was an island. Whether you stood in the fertile mud of the Nile Delta or the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, your reality was defined by what you could see with the naked eye. To the ancient Sumerians and Egyptians, the earth was a vast, flat disk, anchored firmly in the center of a chaotic, watery void. There was no space as we understand it today, only the great below and the great above. In the minds of the people of Mesopotamia, the world was a multi-layered sandwich of cosmic proportions. They believed the earth was a flat circular plane floating upon a freshwater ocean called the Apsu. Above this plane sat a series of solid domes, the heavens, crafted from precious stones like lapis lazuli. These domes weren't empty. They were the dwelling places of gods who controlled the rain, the wind, and the terrifying lightning. To look at the horizon was to see the place where the roof of the world met the floor. It was a comforting, if claustrophobic, design. Everything had its place, and humans were safely tucked in the middle. To the west, the Egyptians viewed the world through the lens of their lifeblood, the Nile. To them, the universe was a box or a chamber. The earth was the floor, personified by the god Geb, who lay flat, while his sister wife, Nut, the sky goddess, arched over him. Her body was the star-speckled canopy of the night. Every evening, the sun god Ra would travel in a golden bark across her back, only to be swallowed and reborn the next morning. In this worldview, the shape of the earth wasn't a matter of geography, it was a matter of theology. The world stayed flat because the gods willed it so,
holding the sky aloft to prevent the primordial waters of chaos from crashing down and drowning existence. Life in these early centuries was lived with a profound sense of the edge. Merchants and soldiers traveled far, but never far enough to challenge the visual lie of the flat horizon. If you walked far enough to the east, you reached the mountains of sunrise. To the west, the gates of the underworld. The idea that the earth could be a curve, a shape with no beginning and no end, wasn't just unheard of, it was a logical impossibility. How could people on the sides not fall off? How could the oceans stay put? This flat island model served humanity for thousands of years. It matched the intuition of the senses. When you look at the sea, it looks level. When you walk across a plain, it feels steady. These ancient cultures built pyramids and ziggurats that reached toward the sky domes, never suspecting that the floor beneath their feet was actually a curve moving through a vacuum. They lived in a world of boundaries. But as the first brave explorers began to push their wooden ships into the Mediterranean and the stars began to shift in unfamiliar ways, the first cracks in the flat earth theory began to appear. The comfort of the island was about to be challenged by the terrifying realization of the sphere.
As the centuries passed, the flat island model began to feel small. The Mediterranean Sea became a highway of trade, and with trade came the exchange of ideas. While the poets still sang of the world as a shield or a disk, a new class of thinkers emerged in the sun-drenched cities of ancient Greece. These weren't just observers, they were the world's first detectives of the cosmos. They began to notice glitches in the reality of a flat Earth, phenomena that didn't make sense if the world was a simple level plane. The first major breakthrough didn't come from a telescope, but from a ship. Greek sailors returning from the Aegean Sea shared a peculiar observation. When a ship approached from the distance, you didn't see the whole vessel at once. First, you saw the tip of the mast poking above the horizon. Then, as it drew closer, the sails appeared, and finally, the hull. If the Earth were flat, a ship would start as a tiny, blurry dot and grow larger as it approached, but it would always be above the waterline. The fact that it seemed to climb up from beneath the horizon suggested something radical. The surface of the water was curved. In the 6th century BCE, the philosopher Pythagoras, better known today for his triangles, began to preach a revolutionary idea. He believed that the sphere was the perfect geometric shape. To Pythagoras and his followers, the gods wouldn't have created a jagged, flat, or irregular world. They would have chosen the most harmonious form. While his reasoning was more mystical than scientific, it planted the seed. He proposed that the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun were all perfect spheres, floating in a cosmic symphony. However, it was Aristotle, nearly 2 centuries later, who provided the smoking gun evidence that would change history. Aristotle was a man of observation. He looked at the sky during a lunar eclipse and noticed something undeniable. As the Earth passed between the Sun and the Moon, it cast a shadow on the lunar surface. That shadow was always, without exception, circular. If the Earth were a flat disk, the shadow would only be a circle if the Sun was directly underneath it. If the Earth were tilted at any other angle during an eclipse, the shadow would be an oval or a thin line. The only shape that casts a circular shadow from every single angle is a sphere. Aristotle didn't stop there. He listened to the accounts of travelers who went south toward Egypt and north toward the Black Sea. They reported that the constellations changed. Stars that were visible in the north disappeared below the horizon in the south, and new stars took their place. On a flat Earth, everyone should see the same stars, no matter how far they walked. The shifting sky was the final proof. The world was a curve, and humans were walking on the outer edge of a massive ball. Yet this discovery brought a new kind of terror. If the Earth was a sphere, what was on the other side? The Greeks began to imagine the antipodes,
people who lived on the bottom of the world, walking upside down with their feet pointing toward ours. This idea was so mind-bending that many rejected it. They couldn't understand gravity. They assumed that anyone on the bottom would simply fall off into the void. To bridge this gap, they imagined the world was held in place by invisible forces, or that down simply meant toward the center of the earth. By the time the Great Library of Alexandria was built, the secret was out. The earth was no longer a flat island, it was a globe. But how big was it? Was it a small ball or a monstrously large one? The stage was set for one of the greatest mathematical feats in human history, where a man with nothing but a stick and a shadow would measure the entire planet. By the 3rd century BCE, the intellectual heart of the world beat in Alexandria, Egypt. In the city's legendary library, a man named Eratosthenes was obsessed with a single question. If the Earth is a sphere, exactly how large is it? To the average person of the time, the world felt infinite. To Eratosthenes, it was a geometry problem waiting to be solved. He didn't need a ship to sail around the world to find the answer. He only needed a stick, a shadow, and a brilliant mind. Eratosthenes had heard a fascinating traveler's tale from the city of Syene, located far to the south. It was said that at noon on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the sun stood directly overhead. If you looked down a deep well at that exact moment, you could see the reflection of the sun in the water at the very bottom, and a vertical pole would cast no shadow at all. The sun's rays were hitting the earth perfectly perpendicular to the surface. Curious, Eratosthenes tested this in Alexandria on the same day at the same time. He planted a vertical rod known as a gnomon into the ground. If the earth were flat, as the ancients had believed for millennia, the sun would be at the same angle everywhere. There should have been no shadow in Alexandria, just as there was no shadow in Syene. But Eratosthenes saw something different. In Alexandria, the rod did cast a shadow. This was the aha moment. Eratosthenes realized that the only way the sun could be directly overhead in one city while casting a shadow in another at the exact same time was if the surface of the earth was curved. By measuring the length of the shadow in Alexandria, he used basic trigonometry to determine that the sun's rays were hitting the city at an angle of about 7.2 degrees. Now came the math. Since a circle has 360 degrees, 7.2 degrees represented exactly 1/50th of the Earth's total circumference. To find the size of the entire planet, he simply needed to know the distance between Alexandria and Syene and multiply it by 50. In an age before GPS or accurate maps, he relied on bematists, professional walkers trained to take perfectly equal steps to measure the distance. They calculated it to be about 5,000 stadia. Eratosthenes did the math. 5,000 times 50 equals 250,000 stadia. While historians debate the exact length of a stadion, most agree his calculation was within 1% to 15% of the Earth's actual circumference. It was a staggering achievement. In one afternoon, the Earth had shrunk from a mysterious, endless expanse into a measurable, finite object. However, knowing the size of the Earth created a new, haunting realization. Eratosthenes' numbers showed that the known world, the Mediterranean, parts of Africa and Asia, occupied only a small fraction of the globe. The rest was a massive, empty void. The Greeks began to speculate. What filled the rest of the sphere? Was it all water? Were there other continents? This new world wasn't a discovery of land, but a discovery of space. The measurement of the Earth didn't just provide a number, it provided a map of our ignorance. Humans finally knew the size of their cage, but they had no idea what else was inside it. As the Roman Empire expanded, the world grew from a philosophical concept into a logistical reality. The Romans were not much for abstract geometry like the Greeks. They were engineers, soldiers, and administrators. To rule the world, they needed to map it.
While the Roman elite accepted the Greek discovery that the Earth was a sphere, the sheer scale of the empire forced them to confront the physical limits of that sphere. They began to wonder, if the Earth is a ball, how much of it is actually habitable? This led to the concept of the oikomene, the inhabited world. The Romans looked at their maps and saw a vast interconnected landmass surrounded by a terrifying encircling oceanus. But their expansion toward the cold mists of Britain and the scorching sands of the Sahara raised new questions about the Earth's climate zones. They began to believe in climate theory, which suggested the Earth was divided into 5 distinct rings or zones. There were 2 frozen poles where life was impossible, 2 temperate zones where humans could thrive, and 1 torrid zone at the equator that was supposedly so hot the oceans boiled and the air turned to fire. For a Roman legionnaire standing on the northern shores of Gaul, looking out across the gray, churning waters toward Britain, the world felt like it was dissolving into chaos. They called the ocean the edge of the world. To them, the sphere wasn't just a shape, it was a prison guarded by climate. They believed that even if the Earth was a globe, humans were trapped in the northern temperate zone. The torrid zone acted as an impassable wall of heat, preventing anyone from ever reaching the southern half of the sphere. This created a sense of isolation. Roman scholars like Pliny the Elder wrote about the possibility of the Antic Thones, people living on the other side of the equator. But in the Roman mind, these people were forever unreachable, separated by a belt of fire. This transformed the shape of the world into something both known and deeply mysterious. They had the math of the sphere, but they lacked the technology to conquer its curves. Maps from this era, like those of Pomponius Mela, show the world as a long, oval-like landmass tucked inside the northern hemisphere. To the Romans, the shape of the world was defined by the reach of their roads. Where the road ended, the world effectively ended. Beyond the borders of the empire lay the barbarian lands and eventually the great ocean, which they imagined as a thick, curdled sea where the sun's light barely penetrated. This period was a strange tug-of-war between science and superstition. While the educated knew the Earth was a globe, the practical reality of travel made the world feel flat and dangerous. The Romans built the most accurate maps of their time, but they always stopped at the water's edge. They feared that if they sailed too far into the Atlantic, the curvature of the Earth would carry them into a realm where the stars were different and the laws of nature no longer applied. They were masters of the land, but they remained terrified of the curve.
In the 2nd century CE, a man named Claudius Ptolemy sat in the bustling, multicultural hub of Alexandria. While Eratosthenes had measured the world's size, Ptolemy wanted to do something even more ambitious. He wanted to pin it down. To Ptolemy, a globe was useless if you didn't know exactly where you were on it. He looked at the vast, curved expanse of the Earth and realized that for humanity to truly master the planet, we needed a system of digital-like precision. He needed a grid. Ptolemy's masterpiece, Geographia, was the first time in history that the Earth was treated like a giant graph. He invented the concepts of latitude and longitude, drawing invisible lines across the sphere to create a coordinate system. This was a massive shift in how humans imagined the world. No longer was a city just 3 days' journey from the sea. It was a set of numbers. It was a fixed point on a mathematical sphere. However, Ptolemy faced a massive problem. How do you take a round Earth and flatten it onto a piece of paper without ruining the shapes of the continents? This is the eternal struggle of the cartographer. Ptolemy developed a method of projection, curving the lines of longitude so that they converged at the poles, trying to give the viewer the sensation of looking at a 3D object on a 2D flat surface.
His maps were the first to look scientific to the modern eye. But Ptolemy was not perfect. Despite his genius, he made a catastrophic error that would echo through history for over 1,000 years. He rejected Eratosthenes' remarkably accurate measurement of the Earth's size. Instead, he relied on later, smaller estimates. Ptolemy's Earth was about 25% smaller than it actually was. In his mind, the Atlantic Ocean wasn't a vast, insurmountable void. It was a manageable gap. This error was compounded by his imagination of what lay beyond the known borders. On his maps, the Indian Ocean was a landlocked sea surrounded by a massive terra incognita, or unknown land, that connected Africa to Asia. He imagined the world as being dominated by land, with the oceans merely acting as large lakes. This gave humans a false sense of confidence. It made the world seem smaller, more crowded, and more conquerable than it actually was. Ptolemy's world was a world of order. His grid gave kings and generals the feeling that they could see the whole world from their desks. But by shrinking the planet and filling the gaps with imaginary land masses, he set a trap for future explorers. For the next millennium, his maps were considered the absolute truth. People stopped looking at the stars to find the shape of the world and started looking at Ptolemy's ink. The Earth had been captured in a grid, but the grid was a lie that would eventually lead Christopher Columbus to think he was in India when he was actually half a world away.
As the Roman Empire crumbled and the great libraries of the ancient world were burned or scattered, a shadow fell over the scientific understanding of the Earth's shape. In Europe, the rigorous mathematics of the Greeks began to fade from the common consciousness, replaced by a worldview that was more symbolic than scientific. For many in the early medieval period, the shape of the world wasn't something to be measured with sticks and shadows. It was something to be interpreted through the lens of faith. The spherical Earth didn't disappear entirely, as the educated clergy still read the classics. But for the general public, the world flattened out once again. This era gave birth to the TO map, a design so simple it looks like a child's drawing today, yet it dominated the human imagination for centuries. In these maps, the world was a perfect circle, the O. Inside that circle, the T represented the waters, the Mediterranean, the Nile, and the Don rivers, which divided the Earth into the three known continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa. In this version of the world, Jerusalem was placed at the exact center. The shape of the world was no longer about geography, it was about spiritual orientation. East was placed at the top of the map because that was where the Garden of Eden was believed to be. The edges of the circle weren't just the horizon, they were the limits of God's creation, beyond which lay the terrifying outer darkness. This wasn't necessarily because people were stupid or forgot the Greek lessons. Rather, the priority had shifted. Survival in a fractured, feudal Europe was more important than calculating the circumference of the globe. The idea of the antipodes, people living on the other side of a sphere, became a dangerous heresy to some. If the world was a ball and people lived on the bottom, how could they be descended from Adam? How could they have heard the word of God if an impassable torrid zone of fire blocked the way? To solve this theological puzzle, many simply found it easier to imagine the world as a flat, stable plane. However, while Europe was looking inward and flattening its maps, the flame of Greek knowledge was being kept alive elsewhere. In the rising Islamic world, scholars were translating Ptolemy and Aristotle into Arabic. In the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the sphere remained a fact. While a peasant in France might have imagined the world as a flat disk ending in a waterfall of monsters, a scholar in Persia was using an astrolabe to track the curvature of the heavens. This period was a strange, great divide in human history. The shape of the world became a matter of where you lived and what you believed.
The ocean, once a highway for the Greeks, became a sea of darkness to the Europeans. They imagined the Atlantic as a place where the water turned into thick slime, where giant magnets pulled the nails out of ships, and where the world eventually just stopped. It would take a new wave of travelers and the return of forgotten texts to pull the world back into a three-dimensional shape.
While the scholars of Europe were sketching symbolic circles on parchment, a group of rugged seafarers from the north was busy carving a different reality into the waves. The Vikings didn't care for the T.O. haps of the church or the ancient scrolls of the Greeks. They were practical explorers. To them, the shape of the world was something you felt in the biting wind and the pull of the currents. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the Norsemen pushed their longships further west than anyone in recorded history. They didn't see the Atlantic as a sea of darkness or a flat edge. They saw it as a series of stepping stones. From Norway to the Faroe Islands, then to Iceland, and finally to the icy fjords of Greenland, the Vikings were inadvertently tracing the curvature of the Earth's northern crown. But their greatest discovery, and the one that most challenged the traditional island view of the world, was Vinland. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson landed on the shores of what we now know as Newfoundland, Canada. For the first time, Europeans had stepped onto a new world. Yet the Vikings didn't realize they had found a new continent. Because their worldview was still rooted in the idea of a central landmass surrounded by ocean, they assumed Vinland was just another island, or perhaps a long peninsula stretching down from northern Europe. The Viking sagas described a world that was vast and filled with Skrellings, indigenous people, and strange resources like wild grapes and timber. However, because the Vikings lacked a global coordinate system like Ptolemy's, their discovery remained a local secret. They knew the world was large, but they didn't have the bird's-eye view necessary to understand that they were standing on a massive landmass that wasn't supposed to exist according to Greek or Roman maps. Back in the heart of Europe, the Viking discoveries were treated as legends rather than geography. The North was seen as a place of monsters and eternal frost. The Vikings, however, had proven something vital. The great ocean was crossable. It wasn't a bottomless abyss or a boiling cauldron. It was water, and if you had the courage, you could sail it until the stars changed position. This period showed the disconnect between knowing the Earth was a sphere and experiencing it. The Vikings experienced the curve of the Earth by noticing how the sun stayed above the horizon for 24 hours in the summer, the midnight sun, a phenomenon that is only possible on a globe. They used sunstones, crystals that could polarize light to find the sun's position even on cloudy days. They were using high-tech physics of the time to navigate a spherical world, even if they didn't have a name for it. The North Atlantic was the first real crack in the closed world of the Middle Ages, proving that the horizon was not a wall, but a gateway. While Europe was largely preoccupied with symbolic maps, the intellectual torch of the world had passed to the caliphates of the Middle East. In the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mamun turned Baghdad into a sanctuary for science. He didn't just want to know if the Earth was a sphere. He wanted to know exactly how much ground was covered in a single degree of the Earth's curve. This was no longer about philosophy. It was about the precision required for navigation and prayer. In the vast, flat desert of Sinjar, al-Mamun gathered a team of astronomers and surveyors. Their mission was deceptively simple: walk until the North Star, Polaris, rose or fell by exactly 1 degree in the sky. To ensure accuracy, 2 teams started at a single point and walked in opposite directions, one north and one south. They used long measuring rods to keep their pace perfect, dragging them across the desert floor with obsessive care. When the two teams met back at the starting point, they compared their distances. By calculating the length of 1 degree of latitude, they could multiply it by 360 to find the total circumference of the Earth. Their result was incredibly close to the actual figure, refining the work of Eratosthenes from centuries earlier. This data allowed Islamic scholars to create the most accurate globes the world had ever seen. One of the greatest minds of this era was al-Biruni. He was a polymath who realized that walking across a desert was a difficult way to measure a planet. Instead, he developed a brilliant new method using a mountain and the horizon. By standing on a mountain peak and measuring the dip of the horizon, the angle between a level line and the line where the sky meets the sea, and knowing the mountain's height, he used a complex sine law to calculate the Earth's radius. His math was so precise that his estimate was within 16.8 kilometers of the modern value. These discoveries had practical daily application. Because Muslims needed to face Mecca, the Qibla, from anywhere in the world, they had to understand the Earth's curvature. You couldn't just point a finger on a flat map. You had to understand great circle routes on a sphere. This necessity turned every mosque builder into a student of the globe. By the time the scholar al-Idrisi created the Tabula Rogerana in 1154 for the king of Sicily, the world was depicted as a sphere. His map was the most advanced in existence, combining data from travelers, merchants, and astronomers. However, because al-Idrisi followed the tradition of placing south at the top, his map looks upside down to modern eyes. It was a reminder that while the shape of the world was becoming a settled fact in the East, the orientation of it was still a matter of perspective. The globe was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a territory to be mapped with the surgical precision of mathematics. As the 12th and 13th centuries dawned, the intellectual fog that had settled over Europe began to lift. This era, often called the Renaissance of the 12th century, was triggered by a massive influx of knowledge from the Islamic world. In the libraries of Toledo in Spain and the courts of Sicily, Latin scholars were busy translating Arabic versions of Greek classics. Suddenly, the works of Aristotle and Ptolemy were back in European hands. The TO maps and the idea of a flat Earth weren't discarded overnight, but they began to face a challenge they couldn't ignore: the revival of logic. University life began to flourish in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna. In these lecture halls, the shape of the world became a central topic of study. One of the most influential books of the time was De Sphera Mundi, On the Sphere of the World, by Johannes de Sacrobosco. It wasn't a dense, inaccessible tome. It was a clear, concise textbook that proved the Earth was a sphere using simple observations. It became required reading for every university student in Europe. For the next 400 years, if you were an educated person, you didn't just suspect the Earth was round, you knew it as a mathematical certainty. However, a spherical Earth created a new kind of tension with the Church. While the Bible didn't explicitly say the Earth was flat, it used poetic language about the four corners of the Earth and the circle of the world. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas stepped in to bridge the gap. Aquinas argued that reason and faith were two sides of the same coin. If the stars and the shadows proved the Earth was a sphere, then that was simply the way God had designed it. The sphere became a symbol of divine perfection rather than a challenge to Scripture. But knowing the Earth was a sphere was one thing, knowing what was on the other side was another. The old Roman fear of the torrid zone still lingered. Many believed that while the Earth was a ball, the southern hemisphere was entirely covered in water, or was a realm of fire where no human could survive. This led to the Mappa Mundi, massive, incredibly detailed maps like the Hereford Mappa Mundi. These maps were strange hybrids. They showed the world as a circle, but they were packed with mythical creatures, biblical history, and real geography all mashed together.
In these maps, you can see the world transitioning. They show the Mediterranean with increasing accuracy, yet they still place the monstrous races, people with their faces in their chests or with single giant feet, at the edges of the world. The shape of the world was becoming a globe in the minds of scholars, but in the hearts of the people, it was still a place of magic and terror. The return of the sphere changed the European psyche. It introduced the idea of the horizon as something that could be surpassed. If the world was a circuit, then theoretically one could sail east to reach the west. This was no longer a madman's dream, it was a mathematical hypothesis. The stage was being set for the age of discovery, but before the ships could sail, a new invention was needed to guide them through the sea of darkness. The world was round, the maps were improving, and humanity was finally getting ready to stop looking at the ground and start looking at the stars to find their way home.
While the scholars in universities were debating the philosophical perfection of the sphere, a different kind of revolution was happening on the docks of Genoa, Venice, and Lisbon. For the men who actually risked their lives on the water, the shape of the world wasn't a matter of theology, it was a matter of survival. These sailors didn't have time for the symbolic TO maps or the artistic mappa mundi. They needed something functional. This need gave birth to the portolan chart. Portolan charts were the first real maps of the sea. Unlike previous maps that focused on the centers of continents, portolans focused on the coastlines. They were characterized by a web of crisscrossing lines known as rum lines, which radiated from central points like the spokes of a wheel. These lines corresponded to the directions on a compass, a revolutionary tool that had recently arrived in Europe. For the first time, a navigator could lay a straight edge on a map, follow a specific compass heading, and actually arrive where they intended to go. The portolan charts revealed a startling truth. The Mediterranean was not the symbolic T-shape of the religious maps. It was a complex, jagged reality of bays, inlets, and islands. As sailors mapped these coastlines with increasing accuracy, they began to notice a persistent problem. When you draw a long-distance route on a flat map using a compass, the straight line doesn't actually account for the Earth's curve. Over short distances in the Mediterranean, this didn't matter much. But as the Portuguese began to creep further south along the coast of Africa, the flat map began to fail them. The Portuguese prince Henry the Navigator turned his court at Sagres into a think tank for global exploration. He brought together Jewish cartographers, Arab astronomers, and Italian sailors. They began to realize that as they moved south, the North Star, the sailors' ultimate guide, sank lower and lower toward the horizon. Once they crossed the equator, it disappeared entirely. They were literally sailing off the map of the known world. To navigate this new reality, they developed the Regimento do Astrolabio, a set of tables that allowed sailors to calculate their latitude based on the height of the midday sun. This was a bridge between the flat world of the portolan chart and the round world of reality. They were learning to read the curve of the Earth. They realized that the world was far longer from north to south than Ptolemy had ever imagined. This era marked the death of the monster-filled horizon. The more the Portuguese sailed, the more they found that the torrid zone wasn't a place of boiling seas, but a place of rich trade and new cultures. The shape of the world was expanding. It was no longer a closed circle. It was an open-ended frontier. The maps were no longer pictures of what we knew. They were becoming tools to find what we didn't know. By the late 1400s, the roundness of the Earth was no longer a theory to be proven. It was a tool to be used. The only question left was, how wide was the ocean to the west? By the late 15th century, the debate wasn't about whether the Earth was a sphere. It was about how much water covered that sphere. Christopher Columbus, a self-taught navigator with an iron will, became obsessed with a mathematical error that would change the course of human history. To convince the monarchs of Europe to fund his voyage, he had to play a dangerous game with the shape of the world.
Columbus relied heavily on the maps of Ptolemy and the calculations of Pierre d'Ailly. As we saw in earlier chapters, Ptolemy had underestimated the Earth's circumference by nearly 25%. Columbus took this mistake and pushed it even further. He decided to use the shortest possible measurement of a degree, and then he overestimated the eastward stretch of Asia. In Columbus's mind, the world was small, much smaller than the Greeks or the Arabs had calculated. He estimated that the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan was only about 2,400 miles. In reality, it is closer to 11,000 miles. When Columbus presented his plan to the Commission of Wise Men in Portugal and later in Spain, they didn't reject him because they thought the earth was flat. On the contrary, they rejected him because they were too smart. They knew their Eratosthenes and their Al-Biruni. They told Columbus his math was wrong and that the earth was far larger than he claimed. They warned him that no ship of that era could carry enough food and water to cross such a massive, empty ocean. They were scientifically correct, but Columbus was lucky. When Columbus finally set sail in 1492, he was navigating a ghost world. For weeks, his crew stared at a horizon that refused to break. The men grew terrified, not of falling off the edge, but of the sheer emptiness of a spherical world that seemed to have no end. To keep them from mutinying, Columbus kept 2 logs, one with the real distance traveled and a fake one with shorter distances, so the crew wouldn't realize how far they were from home. When he finally hit land in the Bahamas, Columbus's bias was so strong that he refused to believe his eyes. He saw the islands and assumed they were the Indies off the coast of China. Even when he encountered plants, animals, and people that matched no descriptions of Asia, he doubled down. He was so wedded to his small Earth theory that he couldn't imagine a third massive landmass existing in the middle of the Atlantic. Columbus's journey proved that the ocean was crossable, but it also proved that the human mind is often slower to change than the maps. He died still believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia. He had stumbled upon a new world by failing to understand the true scale of the old one. The great mistake of Columbus didn't just find America. It forced the rest of the world to finally accept that the Earth was not just a sphere, but a massive, complex, and still largely unknown planet. The small Earth was dead. The age of the giant Earth had begun.
While Columbus remained stubbornly locked in his vision of a small Earth, a Florentine explorer named Amerigo Vespucci began to look at the new coastlines with a more critical, scientific eye. Vespucci wasn't just a sailor, he was a businessman and a keen observer of the stars. Between 1497 and 1504, he made several voyages to the landmasses that Columbus had claimed were part of Asia. But as Vespucci sailed further south, along the coast of what is now Brazil, he realized something that would shatter the medieval worldview forever. Vespucci noticed that the stars above him were completely different from those seen in Europe, or even in the northern parts of the Indies. He saw the Southern Cross and stars that no Greek or Roman astronomer had ever catalogued. Furthermore, the sheer scale of the coastline was staggering. He sailed for thousands of miles, and the land just kept going. If this were Asia, the geography made no sense. The animals were different, the people spoke entirely unknown languages, and the climate didn't match the descriptions of the Far East provided by Marco Polo. In 1503, Vespucci wrote a letter titled Mundus Novus, New World. In it, he boldly claimed that the lands discovered to the west were not the edges of Asia, but a fourth part of the world, a continent previously unknown to Europeans, Asians, and Africans. This was a seismic shift in human perspective. For centuries, the world was imagined as a trinity of continents centered around Jerusalem. Vespucci's new world meant the sphere was much more crowded than anyone had dared to dream. The impact of Vespucci's realization was cemented in 1507 by a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller.
Working in a small French town, Waldseemüller and a team of scholars were creating a new map of the world that would incorporate the latest discoveries. Inspired by Vespucci's writings, they drew a massive, slender continent separated from Asia by a vast, unexplored ocean. Across this new land, they printed the name America, in honor of Americo. This map, often called the birth certificate of America, was the first to show the Pacific Ocean as a separate body of water, even though no European had yet seen it from the east. It transformed the shape of the world from a known, limited space into an open-ended puzzle. The Earth was now a globe that contained an entire extra world. The discovery of America didn't just add a continent to the map, it subtracted the certainty that humans knew everything about their home. However, the new world created a massive logistical problem. If America was a continent, how do you get around it to reach the spices of the East? The shape of the world was now seen as a giant obstacle. The race was on to find a passage through or around this new wall of land. The final proof of the Earth's shape was no longer a matter of looking at shadows or stars. It was about to become a grueling physical test of endurance. A man named Ferdinand Magellan was about to try and draw a physical line around the entire sphere, proving once and for all that the horizon always leads back to the start.
By 1519, the world was a puzzle with one giant missing piece. Maps showed the New World as a barrier, but no one knew how deep it went or what lay beyond it. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator sailing under the Spanish flag, proposed a gamble that most deemed a suicide mission. He didn't just want to find a shortcut to the Spice Islands, he intended to physically trace the curvature of the Earth until he returned to his starting point. This wasn't just a voyage of trade, it was the ultimate stress test for the spherical Earth theory. Magellan's fleet of 5 ships, the Armada de Molucca, faced a reality far more terrifying than any ancient myth. As they sailed further south along the coast of South America, the weather turned lethal. They weren't just fighting waves, they were fighting the shape of the world. They spent months searching for a passage through the continent, poking into every bay and river, fearing that the land might stretch all the way to the frozen pole. When they finally found the narrow, labyrinthine strait that now bears Magellan's name, they emerged into an ocean so vast and so calm that Magellan named it Mar Pacifico, the Pacific. But the Pacific was a trap. Based on the small Earth maps of Ptolemy and Columbus, Magellan expected the crossing to take a few weeks. Instead, it took nearly 4 months of sheer horror. The crew ran out of food and water. They were forced to eat sawdust, leather from the ship's rigging, and rats. Scurvy rotted their gums. This agonizing delay was the first physical proof of the Earth's true scale. The Pacific Ocean was not a minor gap. It was a massive blue void that occupied nearly a third of the planet. The Earth was much, much larger than even the most daring scholars had dared to imagine. Magellan himself never finished the journey. He was killed in a skirmish in the Philippines, caught in a local conflict that had nothing to do with global geography. However, his remaining crew, led by Juan Sebastián Elcano, pushed on. Only one ship, the Victoria, managed to limp back into the harbor of Sanlúcar de Barrameda in 1522. Out of the 270 men who began the voyage, only 18 skeletal survivors returned. The return of the Victoria was a turning point in human consciousness. For the first time, a physical object had made a full circuit of the planet. But there was one final mind-bending surprise for the survivors. According to the ship's log, which had been meticulously kept every single day, the date of their return was Wednesday. But to the people on shore, it was Thursday. The sailors were baffled. They hadn't missed a day. They hadn't slept through a 24-hour period. They had inadvertently discovered the circumnavigation paradox.
By sailing west, following the sun, they had effectively gained a day by moving against the rotation of the Earth. This chronological glitch was the final undeniable proof that the Earth was a rotating sphere. The horizon was no longer a mystery, it was a closed loop. The world had been stitched together by a single bloody wake, and the age of planetary isolation was over forever.
With the Earth now proven to be a massive, rotating sphere, a new crisis emerged for the people who actually had to navigate it. The world was round, but paper was flat. For centuries, sailors had struggled with a fundamental geometric conflict. How do you plot a straight course on a curved surface? If a captain drew a straight line on a standard map and followed his compass, he would eventually find himself miles off course because of the way the Earth's meridians converge at the poles. The spherical reality of the world was actually making navigation more difficult. In 1569, a Flemish cartographer named Gerardus Mercator solved this problem with a stroke of mathematical genius that would define our mental image of the world for the next 5 centuries. Mercator didn't just draw a map, he created a mathematical projection. He imagined wrapping a cylinder of paper around the globe and projecting the features of the Earth onto it. To make the compass lines, rhumb lines, stay straight, he had to intentionally distort the map. He stretched the northern and southern latitudes, making the land masses near the poles appear much larger than they actually were. This was the birth of the square world. On Mercator's map, Greenland appeared to be the same size as Africa, even though Africa is actually 14 times larger. Europe looked massive, dominating the center of the world, while the equatorial regions were compressed. But for a sailor, this distortion didn't matter. What mattered was that a straight line on the map was now a constant compass bearing. For the first time, a navigator could draw a line from Lisbon to New York, measure the angle, and sail that exact heading without having to constantly recalculate for the Earth's curve. This projection fundamentally changed how humans imagined the shape of their home. Because Mercator's maps became the standard for education and navigation, people began to visualize the Earth as a flat rectangular grid rather than a sphere. The poles were no longer points at the top and bottom of a ball. They were long, stretched-out lines at the edges of a page. The world felt wider, more organized, and, crucially, more conquerable. The Mercator map was the ultimate tool for the age of imperialism. It made the vast oceans look like manageable blocks of space. It turned a mysterious curved Earth into a flat playing board where empires could move their pieces with mathematical certainty. However, while Mercator was flattening the world for sailors, astronomers were looking up and realizing that the Earth wasn't just a sphere, it was a sphere in motion. The shape of the world was about to be challenged again, not by its surface, but by its place in the heavens. If the Earth was a ball, was it the center of everything, or just a tiny speck spinning through an even larger void? While explorers were physically conquering the Earth's surface, a quiet revolution was brewing in the towers of Poland. For nearly 2,000 years, the shape of the world was tied to a singular, comforting idea. The Earth was a stationary ball at the absolute center of the universe. This was the geocentric model, championed by Ptolemy and endorsed by the Church. In this view, the sun, moon, and stars were merely celestial ornaments revolving around the human stage. But as astronomers tracked the planets, they noticed glitches that a stationary sphere couldn't explain. Nicolaus Copernicus, a mathematician and cleric, began to suspect that our vision of the world was flawed because our vantage point was moving. He realized that the strange, looping paths of planets like Mars, which sometimes appeared to move backward in the sky, were an optical illusion. This retrograde motion only made sense if the Earth itself was a sphere in orbit.
In 1543, on his deathbed, he published De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, a book that ripped the Earth from its pedestal and set it spinning around the sun. This changed the shape of the world in a psychological sense. The Earth was no longer the heavy, unmoving foundation of existence. It became a wanderer, a celestial vessel. Copernicus proposed that the Earth performed two distinct movements. It rotated on its axis once every 24 hours and revolved around the sun once a year. This explained why the stars shifted and why the sun rose and set. But it created a terrifying new problem for the average person. If the Earth was spinning at hundreds of miles per hour, why didn't we feel it? Why didn't the birds get left behind when they took flight? Why didn't the oceans fly off into space? Without a concept of gravity or inertia, the idea of a moving sphere felt like madness. To imagine the world as a spinning top was to live in a state of constant, invisible motion. It made the Earth feel fragile, a small marble tossed into a vast, sun-centered clockwork. This shift, known as the Copernican Revolution, met fierce resistance. It wasn't just a scientific debate, it was a crisis of identity. If the Earth wasn't the center, then humans weren't the center of God's attention. The shape of the world was expanding beyond the physical crust of the planet into the mechanics of the solar system. We were starting to realize that to understand the Earth, we had to stop looking at its dirt and start looking at its relationship with the stars. The move from a stationary sphere to a moving one set the stage for the next great leap in understanding. If the Earth was spinning, was it a perfect sphere? Or did the sheer force of that spin change its shape? As the 17th century approached, the world was about to be weighed, measured, and squashed by the laws of physics.
By the late 17th century, the world had accepted that the Earth was a sphere, but a new scientific war was about to break out over its exact proportions. On one side was the French Academy of Sciences, who believed the Earth was an oblong spheroid, shaped like a football, elongated at the poles. On the other side was a soft-spoken but revolutionary English physicist named Isaac Newton. Newton proposed something that sounded absurd to the ears of the time. The Earth was not a perfect ball, nor was it a football. It was an oblate spheroid. It was shaped like a squashed orange. Newton's argument was rooted in his newly discovered laws of motion and universal gravitation. He looked at the Earth as a massive, spinning, fluid body. He realized that if the Earth was rotating at high speeds, the centrifugal force, the same force that pulls you toward the door of a car when it takes a sharp turn, would be strongest at the equator. This force would pull the Earth's mass outward at its waistline, while gravity pulled it inward. Newton calculated that this tug-of-war between gravity and rotation would cause the Earth to bulge at the equator and flatten at the poles. To prove his point, he used a thought experiment involving two tubes of water meeting at the Earth's center, one reaching to a pole and one to the equator. Because of the rotation, the water in the equatorial tube would be lighter and thus need to be longer to balance the weight of the polar tube. The French were insulted. They prided themselves on their superior surveying techniques and their measurements of the French meridian. To settle the Battle of the Spheroids, the French king sent two daring expeditions to the ends of the Earth in the 1730s. One team, led by Pierre-Louis Maupertuis, headed to the freezing Arctic of Lapland. The other, led by Charles-Marie de la Condamine, headed to the equatorial mountains of Peru, modern-day Ecuador. Their mission was simple: measure the length of 1 degree of latitude in both places. If Newton was right, a degree of latitude would be longer near the pole than at the equator, because the Earth's curve would be flatter there. The expeditions were harrowing.
In Lapland, the team fought off frostbite and swarms of insects. In Peru, they faced altitude sickness, jungle fevers, and local uprisings. For 10 years, the world waited for the results. When the data finally came back, the verdict was clear. Newton was right. The Earth was fatter at the middle. The difference was small. The Earth's equatorial diameter is about 43 kilometers wider than its polar diameter, but the implications were massive. It meant the Earth wasn't a static, perfect geometry created by the gods. It was a dynamic, flexible object shaped by the laws of physics. We weren't just living on a sphere. We were living on a spinning, bulging physical machine. The perfect world of the ancients had finally been replaced by the imperfect, measurable world of science.
By the 19th century, the squashed orange shape of the Earth was an accepted fact, but the British Empire wanted more than just a theory. They wanted a perfect map of their most valuable colony, India. This desire sparked the Great Trigonometrical Survey, one of the most monumental scientific undertakings in human history. It was a project that would last over 70 years, cost more lives than many small wars, and eventually revealed that the Earth's surface wasn't just curved, it was lumpy. The survey was led by men like William Lambton and George Everest. Their goal was to measure the entire Indian subcontinent with mathematical lightning. They used a technique called triangulation. They would build massive stone towers on hilltops, sometimes 100 feet high, to see over the jungle haze. From the top of these towers, they used a theodolite, a half-ton precision instrument made of brass and glass, to measure the exact angles between distant points. By knowing the length of one baseline on the ground and the angles to a third point, they could calculate distances across hundreds of miles without ever laying a tape measure down. As the surveyors moved north toward the Himalayas, they encountered a phenomenon that threatened to break their math. They were using plumb bobs, weights on strings, to ensure their instruments were perfectly level. They assumed the heavy lead weight would point directly toward the center of the Earth. But near the massive peaks of the Himalayas, they noticed the plumb bob was being pulled slightly to the side. The sheer mass of the mountains was exerting its own gravitational tug, warping the definition of down. This led to a startling realization about the shape of the world. If mountains could pull on gravity, then the level surface of the ocean, if it were to flow under the continents, wouldn't be a smooth curve. It would bulge and dip depending on the density of the rocks and the height of the mountains. This invisible, undulating shape is what scientists call the geoid. The Great Trigonometrical Survey proved that the Earth was far more complex than a simple geometric solid. It was a world of local irregularities. While they were at it, the surveyors also calculated the height of the world's tallest peaks. They discovered Peak XV, which they later named Mount Everest. They found that even at the top of the world, the curvature of the Earth was visible. From the summit, the horizon falls away in a way that makes the observer feel the planet's roundness. By the time the survey was completed, the British had mapped India with an accuracy of within a few inches over thousands of miles. They had turned the great unknown into a grid of triangles. But more importantly, they had discovered that the Earth's shape is tied to its mass. The world wasn't just a shape in space. It was a heavy, uneven, gravitational entity. Humans had measured the surface and the squash, but they were still looking at the world from the ground. The final evolution of our understanding would require us to leave the surface entirely and look back from the stars.
As the 20th century arrived, humanity discovered a new way to see the shape of the world without using their eyes. The invention of the radio by pioneers like Guglielmo Marconi presented a scientific puzzle that threatened to turn the clock back on our understanding of the sphere. In 1901, Marconi claimed he had sent a wireless signal across the Atlantic Ocean from England to Canada.
This sparked an immediate controversy. If the Earth was a sphere, radio waves, which were thought to travel in straight lines, should have shot off into space the moment they hit the horizon. According to the math of a curved Earth, the bulge of the Atlantic Ocean should have acted like a massive wall of water, blocking the signal from reaching the other side. Some skeptics even used this as evidence that the Earth was flatter than we thought. The answer didn't come from the ground, but from the sky. Scientists realized that the Earth wasn't just a lumpy, squashed ball of rock. It was encased in an invisible electrical shell called the ionosphere. This layer of the atmosphere acts like a mirror for certain radio frequencies. The signals weren't traveling through the Earth or cutting through the curve. They were skipping off the sky and bouncing back down to the surface, following the curvature of the planet like a ball bouncing inside a dome. This discovery changed our imagination of the world's shape yet again. We began to see the Earth not as an isolated object, but as a planet with layers. The shape of our world wasn't just defined by where the dirt ended and the air began. We had to include the magnetic field, the atmosphere, and the radiation belts. The shape of the world became a series of nested spheres, each protecting life from the harsh vacuum of space. Furthermore, the use of radio waves allowed for the creation of the first global time synchronization. By sending signals at the speed of light, we could finally measure the distance between continents with millisecond precision. We discovered that the continents themselves were moving. The shape of the world was shifting, slowly but surely, as the tectonic plates drifted. We were no longer just measuring a static ball. We were measuring a living, breathing, and radiating system. We had mapped the coastlines, the mountains, and even the invisible electrical ceiling of the sky. But for all our math and all our bouncing radio waves, no human had ever actually seen the curve of the Earth with their own eyes from a distance. We were like ants crawling on a balloon, sensing the curve, but unable to see the whole object. That was about to change. The age of the eye in the sky was born. For thousands of years, the shape of the Earth was a conclusion drawn from shadows, math, and the disappearing masts of ships. No human had ever stood back far enough to see the world as a single, unified object. We were a species confined to the skin of the apple, arguing about the shape of the fruit. But in the mid-20th century, the surge of rocket technology, born from the fires of World War II, finally gave us the keys to the outside. On October 24, 1946, a V-2 rocket, captured from the Germans and launched from the New Mexico desert, carried a 35mm motion picture camera into the blackness above. It climbed to an altitude of 65 miles, just reaching the edge of space. The camera was destroyed upon impact when the rocket crashed back to Earth, but the film, protected in a steel cassette, survived. When scientists developed the footage, the world saw something that stopped their hearts, a grainy, black-and-white image of the Earth's horizon, clearly and undeniably curved, with the white wisps of clouds hovering over the dark expanse of the planet. This was the first unfiltered truth. It was one thing to read a textbook by Newton or Eratosthenes. It was another to see the arc of the planet against the infinite dark. However, these early photos only showed a slice of the world. As the space race intensified, the goal shifted from seeing the curve to seeing the whole. In 1968, during the Apollo 8 mission, humans left Earth's orbit for the first time to head toward the moon. As the crew, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, emerged from the far side of the moon, they witnessed what is now considered the most influential photograph in history, Earthrise. They saw the Earth not as a map, not as a collection of countries, and not as a flat plain, but as a vibrant, fragile blue marble hanging in a total, magnificent emptiness.
This image fundamentally changed human psychology. Seeing the world's shape from the outside made the borders we fought over seem invisible, and the distances we once thought infinite seem tiny. The Earth was revealed to be a closed system, a lonely oasis of life in a desert of radiation and vacuum. We realized that the edge of the world wasn't a physical drop-off or a waterfall into chaos. The edge was the thin, glowing line of our atmosphere, the only thing protecting the sphere from the void. The shape of the world was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a home to be protected. The big blue marble photo, taken a few years later by Apollo 17, gave us the first fully illuminated view of the entire sphere. It was the final nail in the coffin of every ancient misconception. The world was indeed a sphere, but it was far more beautiful and far more isolated than any ancient philosopher had ever dared to dream. We had finally stepped back far enough to see our own reflection in the cosmic mirror.
Today, we live in an age where the shape of the world is no longer a matter of discovery, but a matter of constant, real-time data. We have moved from the island in the ocean to the blue marble, and finally to the digital twin. In the 21st century, the Earth is wrapped in a high-tech cocoon of thousands of satellites. These digital eyes don't just see the curve of the horizon. They measure the height of the ocean to the millimeter and track the movement of continents to the width of a fingernail. Through tools like GPS and Google Earth, the ancient dream of Ptolemy's grid has been perfected. We carry the entire world in our pockets. The shape of the world is now something we interact with every time we use a map on our phones. But as our measurements become more precise, we have rediscovered that the Earth is even stranger than a squashed orange. We now use the GRACE satellites to map the Earth's gravity in such detail that we can see the planet breathing. We see the Earth's shape change as ice sheets melt and groundwater is pumped out of the soil. The world is a dynamic, shifting organism. Yet, even in an age of total information, the human imagination still grapples with the scale of our home. We are now looking beyond the Earth to the shapes of other worlds. We have found planets that are shaped like eggs due to the gravity of their nearby stars, and we have seen flat rings around gas giants that dwarf our own planet. The lessons we learned from measuring the Earth, from Eratosthenes' stick to Newton's math, are now being used to measure the entire universe. The story of how we imagined the shape of the world is the story of humanity's growth. We began as children in a small, flat room, terrified of the corners. We grew into explorers who realized the room was a hall, then a sphere, and finally a tiny ship in a vast cosmic ocean. Every time we changed the shape of the world, we changed ourselves. We moved from a species of local tribes to a global civilization that realizes its shared destiny on a single, finite ball of rock. The horizon is no longer an edge or a wall. It is a curve that invites us to keep going. As we look toward Mars and beyond, we carry the same curiosity that drove the first Sumerian to wonder what lay past the river, or the first Greek to look at the shadow on the moon. The shape of the world is ultimately the shape of our own curiosity, always expanding, always curving toward the next great mystery. We have mapped the Earth, but the map is never finished because the world is not just a shape, it is a journey.